Did you know that Nintendo canceled the Zelda game between Link's Awakening and Ocarina of Time so they could make Star Fox 64 instead? We've covered quite a few lost Zelda games over the years, but today we're going to take extra deep dives into 3 of them: Zelda Super FX, Zelda Treasure Tracker, and Ura Zelda. We worked with some data miners, translated old magazine interviews from around the world, and even talked to a couple guys who worked on those games, all to dig up some new info that you definitely haven't heard before. So let's get into it, starting with the follow-up to Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, that was planned as the series' first footsteps into the third dimension. The game was being developed for the Super Famicom, that's the Japanese version of the Super Nintendo, around 1994. And just like Star Fox, the cartridge would have had a Super FX chip inside. Those chips were fully capable of rendering 3D polygons and would have made Zelda one of the most powerful games on the console, maybe the most powerful. Not only that, but Nintendo also put some of their top developers on the project. Zelda Super FX has been shrouded in mystery for decades, but thanks to some leaks and new translations, we've got some early Link models, animations, and some information never available in English before. In a 1995 issue of Edge magazine, Miyamoto said they were going to release a lot of Super FX games over the coming year, but only 4 of them ended up making it to store shelves. Several more were in development but ultimately got cancelled, the most famous of which was Star Fox 2. It was 100% complete, but Nintendo threw it in the trash because they were afraid it was going to look like trash compared to games already coming out on the PlayStation, with them specifically citing Ridge Racer. Side-by-side comparisons would have made Nintendo look weak and behind the times, so they decided to slow their roll with 3D until the Nintendo 64 launched a year later. We heard that there was a Zelda title that met the same fate, and some details could be found in the official Japanese strategy guide for Star Fox 64, so we bought a copy from Japan and had it translated. Inside there was a 6-page interview where Miyamoto and a few other devs reveal not only the cancelled game's existence, but also that Takayo Shimizu, Kazuaki Morita, and Takaya Imamura were all working on it. For folks unfamiliar with these guys, well, basically they're all Nintendo OGs. Just to name some of their highlights, Shimizu was Star Fox 64's director and also directed BS Zelda, the Zelda 1 remake only released in Japan. Morita programmed the original Adventure of Link and was the main programmer on Ocarina of Time. And Imamura was art director on Majora's Mask, as well as the creator of Star Fox, Captain Falcon, and Tingle. In the interview translation, Shimizu says, "Actually, the 3 of us were working on a Super Famicom version of Adventure of Link. But then the 64 wave came and I told Miyamoto that it would take 2 years to make this Link game. He asked me what the heck I was talking about." Miyamoto chimes in and says, "I was quite shocked." The interviewer asks, "So this was some time ago?" Miyamoto replies, "Yeah, back when there were still tyrannosaurs roaming Japan." Just kidding. Jokes aside though, yeah, we started Star Fox 64 a year before the N64 came out. All of these guys went on to have prominent roles in Star Fox 64's development, so it sounds like Link died so Fox could fly. Simply put, Zelda got cancelled because it would have arrived too late in the Super Famicom's life cycle, about a year after the Nintendo 64 was already on the market. That's why it got cancelled. But what kind of game would it have been? Even in Japan, not much else was known until 2011. That's when Yoshiaki Kazumi revealed he was part of the team as well and dropped a few more details. He said, "I really like Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link, before Super Mario 64. I had actually been making Adventure of Link in polygons with Miyamoto. When asked if he meant for Super Famicom, Koizumi said yes, we were experimenting with a thin polygon Link seen from the side and fighting with his sword. Chanbara was a pending issue at the time. We couldn't really bring Adventure of Link into form at that time, but I kept that desire to achieve a sword-fighting Legend of Zelda game until I joined the Ocarina of Time team." Chanbara here basically means exaggerated samurai-style sword fighting. The original Adventure of Link introduced the down thrust, up thrust, and a few other moves, but combat was still pretty basic. Ocarina's combat was very much influenced by Chanbara, and would have been interesting to see how they would have implemented it into Zelda Super FX. Koizumi was scriptwriter for Link's Awakening, so with him and those 3 other rock stars on the job and Miyamoto overseeing it, Adventure of Link had all the ingredients to become something special. A lot of fans consider the original Adventure of Link the black sheep of the franchise, and Miyamoto appears to think so too. In 2013, Miyamoto was asked if he'd ever made a bad game, and he said, "I wouldn't say that I've ever made a bad game per se, but a game I think we could have done more with was Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link. When we're designing games, we have our plan for what we're going to design, but in our process it evolves and grows from there. In Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, unfortunately all we ended up creating was what we originally had on paper. Now, almost a decade later, with a dream team, more powerful hardware, and some new ideas, it seems Miyamoto was aiming to fix what they had failed to do the first time. But unfortunately, they waited too long to start start making it. And by 1995, the PlayStation was making the super effects look like cave drawings. In the 2 interviews where the game gets mentioned, the devs call it Adventure of Link for Super Famicom. Some Japanese fan wikis classify it as a sequel to the original Famicom game, but the primary sources don't specify if it was actually a sequel or more of a remake. We spoke briefly to one of the game's developers, but he'd only confirmed that he had worked on it and refused to define if it was either a remake or a sequel. Nintendo doesn't like squealers, unfortunately, and they had never released a single screenshot of the game, but in 2020, the GigaLeak revealed what appeared to be early Link models from the abandoned project. They were found in a file called the Koizumi and dated July 27, 1994, which implies Nintendo worked on the game for about a year before scrapping it to begin work on Star Fox 64. The models were discovered by a modder named Starkson, who already had tons of experience with the super effects after reverse engineering Star Fox years before. What you're seeing now is Link imported into the Star Fox engine, because they use the same model format and the same standard color palette. We got in touch with Starkson and asked if he thinks that these models are from the long-lost Adventure of Link. He said, "They are very early experiments. They surely have something to do with what Koizumi was describing in that Iwata interview, but they seem to be very, very early in the process." Starkson's a bit of an expert on the Super FX chip, so we asked if it was capable of more complex models that could have looked, better, or if this was as lifelike as it was going to get. He said with enemies, obstacles, and scenery, they couldn't have made models much more detailed than what you're seeing now. Although it's worth noting, Link probably would have been a different color in the final game, and also would have been a lot smaller and surrounded by the game world, so he wouldn't have come across as quite so blocky. After all, if you look at pretty much anything from that era close enough, it all looks like lifeless squares. Starkson also told us that as far as he knows, no one's found any other assets in the GigaLeak like items, locations, or other character models. But that said, the leak contained tens of thousands of files, so maybe there's more in there that data miners haven't found yet. It's possible that someday they'll dig up the right file and discover a half-built Hyrule. So until more information's either revealed by Nintendo or found in a leak, what we've shared in this video is everything there is to know since the game's cancellation 25 years ago. While we were searching the internet for more details, we stumbled over a Japanese fan site that engaged in an interesting thought experiment, and we'll close out this segment by sharing their thoughts on what they call the Adventure of Link 2, the unfinished 5th Zelda game. They write, "It seems development ended halfway through due to timing issues, but one wonders what kind of game it would have been if development continued. After it released, maybe the franchise would have split into 2, a sub-series for 3D and a sub-series for side-scrolling Zeldas, like what happened to the Mario franchise. If this project was released to the world, perhaps the history of Zelda would have been different. Whether that timeline was better or worse than the one we're currently living in, we'll leave that up to you to decide." And now on to the next game we're going to talk about, Ura Zelda, a disk drive expansion to Ocarina of Time that met a similar fate as Zelda Super FX. Ura Zelda's been covered by countless other YouTube channels already, but a lot of them are filled with rumors and half-truths. We managed to dig up some new information on what was real and what wasn't. So we figured, what the hell, there's probably room on YouTube for at least one more video. For the past 2 decades, there have been 2 schools of thought. The fans with a wildly overinflated idea of what Ura Zelda really was, like that Zora's domain was going to get unfrozen, and Link could finally outrace the Running Man, and the opposite side of the spectrum. The fans who insist it was never going to be anything more than the Master Quest, the GameCube bonus disc that was just Ocarina of Time with remixed dungeons and increased difficulty. But really, the truth is somewhere in the middle. At a Q&A session around the time Ocarina's development was wrapping up, someone asked Miyamoto, will there be a 64DD Zelda or an add-on for Ocarina of Time? He said, I don't know if add-on is the right terminology. For the 64DD, we are working on a Zelda game, which we call Ura Zelda, where you first play Ocarina of Time. After finishing everything, you can enter into the world, into the basic design of the same. The basic design of the same. Pretty vague, right? Possibly poor translation work from 1990s American press, but even if that's the case with this particular quote, it's fair to say Miyamoto used a lot of vague language to describe what Ura Zelda was going to be throughout its entire development. He did occasionally drop some solid details though, but unfortunately not usually in English. At this point in our research, we had to dig through a few thousand old gaming magazines from around the world to find all the Ura Zelda interviews. So let's work our way through them. Then, onto some data mining. The week Ocarina hit store shelves, Miyamoto told Next Gen magazine, Ocarina of Time was designed with the introduction of the DD in mind, and if you load the game with the drive connected to your system, you will see a different title screen option, which says Ura Zelda, another version of Zelda. This was actually a mistranslation from Next Generation. I've got my copy of Ocarina and a 64DD right here next to me. This is what you'd see. It doesn't actually say Ura Zelda, it just says disc. When you boot up the cartridge with the DD attached, the game will just boot per usual. However, we can trick trick the game into thinking Ura is present with a custom disc or software emulation. Every Ocarina cartridge was manufactured with the expectation that Ura Zelda was already on the way and millions of players were going to connect it to their Ocarina carts. It never happened, obviously, but we'll get into that later. In that same interview, Miyamoto goes on to say, "There were several ideas I could not incorporate into Zelda because of the lack of time and various other factors. For example, I wanted to create some extra dungeons and challenges for those who had completed the quest, and we planned them for the predicted introduction of the DD. One feature in particular that Miyamoto wanted to do in Ocarina but couldn't was connectivity features with the Game Boy. Talking to Japanese magazine 64 Dream, he said Majora's Mask would not let players create custom masks, but hinted they might be able to do so in Ura Zelda, by using the Game Boy camera together with Mario Artist. At the time, Nintendo was already experimenting with a similar feature for Mother 3, another disk drive game that never saw the light of day. But we weren't sure if that stuff actually got worked on, or if it was just an early idea Miyamoto threw out there willy-nilly in a couple of interviews. Lucky for us, tons of N64 development assets dropped in the 2020 Gigaleak. We wanted to dig through them and check for mask customization in Ura Zelda, but frankly, it's a lot more complicated than we're equipped to handle. So we talked to Luigi Blood, an Ocarina of Time modder and 64DD enthusiast who'd already spent countless hours digging through all that leaked data. We'll try not to use too much technical jargon, but basically he told us that Ocarina's assets showed it was compatible with Mario Artist, just like Miyamoto talked about. That compatibility was removed from Ocarina's retail release, but Luigi Blood noted, they also messed with masks during Ura Zelda development. There are traces where they seemingly wanted to do something with the Gerudo mask and Keaton mask. Unfortunately, I don't know what for, as the disk source code is not present in the Gigaleak, only the base information and makefiles. All I can see is that the disk side code keeps track of the model file location, possibly to replace the mask files. In other words, new mask stuff in Ura Zelda was indeed more than just empty chatter. Nintendo was actually making it at one point. Another interesting feature Miyamoto talked about was an online component. In the August 98 issue of Nintendo Power, having just finished making Ocarina, Miyamoto said, "We've already talked about a network Zelda as an interesting idea. The assistance of other players in the network could motivate a player's active participation instead of the traps or secrets that I create." And the 64DD was fully capable of accessing the internet. In fact, most people who bought it paid 2,500 yen a month for an online subscription. But again, we weren't sure if those network features actually got worked on. We checked with Luigi Blood, but he said there weren't any traces in the Gigaleak. But the leak was incomplete and missing lots of data, so network features not being in there didn't necessarily mean they weren't in development. Fortunately, Miyamoto wasn't alone in that Nintendo Power interview. There were 3 other Zelda developers, one of them being a very young Giles Goddard. Giles was the first non-Japanese programmer to ever work for Nintendo, basically because Nintendo couldn't find anyone in Japan who could match his whiz-kid programming skills. Giles worked on Star Fox, which was revolutionary for achieving 3D in the 16-bit era, and he also made the stretchy face for Super Mario 64. More importantly though, he worked on Zelda. Giles left Nintendo in 2002, and now he lives on a small, idyllic Japanese island running his own studio and making games like Curse to Golf. We tracked him down to ask some questions about the old days. We talked for half an hour about various projects, and toward the end, we read him the quote from his interview with Miyamoto in 1998. Here's his response.
Do you recall any specifics regarding work on this network Zelda that have never made their way into a finished Zelda game?
Yes. And I want to stay alive, so I'm not gonna say what.
Giles wasn't willing to share any details beyond the fact that they did work on those network features that were never made public, and that they were, and still are, top secret. But just knowing Network Zelda was more than empty chatter was interesting in itself. Miyamoto saying players would replace his traps and secrets kinda sounds like a dungeon builder, where you could design your own dungeons and share them online. We went looking for evidence, but eventually realized that wasn't the correct interpretation when we found a German magazine where Miyamoto specifically said no, there won't be a dungeon builder. Interestingly though, he does describe a different dungeon system than the static remixes that made their way into Master Quest. Instead of simply remixing dungeons, he said they were going to be randomized. The Germans asked what'll make Ura different from Ocarina, and Miyamoto said simply put there will be a random element. Every time you go into a dungeon, the composition will be different. For example, if a treasure chest was in a certain place the first time you entered the dungeon, it won't be there the next time, but will be in a completely different location. Then he says there won't be a dungeon builder or something like an online versus mode, but because of the 64DD's read and write capabilities, they're thinking about new downloadable dungeons and sharing other data with players. That seems to line up with what he told a Mexican magazine a couple months later, that there's a potential for hundreds of dungeons. Both of these interviews were in late 1999 though, though. By then, it seems Miyamoto had already given up on adding new features outside of Hyrule's dungeons. That's because at that point, Ura Zelda had already been neutered in favor of Majora's Mask due to Eiji Aonuma thinking Ura wouldn't make a worthy sequel. Talking to Nintendo President Satoru Iwata, he said Miyamoto felt like there was still a lot left to do and wanted to make new ways to play and a new story. But as Ocarina's dungeon director, Aonuma just couldn't get excited about making new ones for Ura. So, Miyamoto offered a compromise. Instead of using Ocarina's assets to make a flip-side game, if they could use those assets to make an entirely new game in 1 year, then Aonuma wouldn't have to work on Ura Zelda. Aonuma took the deal. Then he and most of the Ocarina team broke off to work on Majora's Mask, leaving a much smaller team left to work on Ura. Even Miyamoto, originally the driving force behind the expansion, abandoned it to focus its attention exclusively on Majora's Mask. With most of its resources stripped, all of those earlier ideas about custom masks, network features, and new story elements fell by the wayside. And that's how Ura Zelda became Master Quest. Instead of an ambitious expansion, it was downgraded to a second quest with remixed dungeons. In a few interviews, Miyamoto teased the idea of releasing Ocarina with remixed dungeons as a $20 N64 cartridge. But by the time Ura's development wrapped up in June of 2000, the GameCube was right around the corner, so they threw it in as a Wind Waker pre-order incentive, and the rest is history. Well, not really though. It's one of the most legendary cancelled games of all time, so history never really ends and the rumors just keep on coming. So we need to debunk some new rumors that came out of the 2020 Giga Leak. You might have heard news that 64DD files were discovered for 9 mini-dungeons, which were intended as a sort of boss rush mode that got cut during Ura's development. Here's the first one, which is only 2 rooms based on the Deku Tree. A modder named Zell was kind enough to reconstruct all 9 mini-dungeons for us. Here's the footage of what it looks like to actually play them. You fight a few enemies, get some treasure, then fight a boss. Most of them are a little bigger, like the Spirit Temple mini-dungeon. When they were discovered in the Giga Leak, since they were 64DD files, a lot of fans thought that they were an Ura Zelda boss rush, and that's what got reported by various websites and YouTubers. A new mode would have been awesome, and really help make Ura feel like a true expansion to Ocarina, but unfortunately, the reality isn't quite as exciting. These mini-dungeons were actually developed before Ocarina was finished, and they appear to just be placeholders for testing out the 64DD's hooks. Hooks are basically just the things that let the game replace one thing for another. In this case, swapping out dungeons. Luigi Blood spent a long time cataloging all of the hooks, and he told us when they made the retail version of Ocarina of Time, they had to have a base disc expansion for testing because it would have been bad if the game came out with a bad disc expansion code within. The only hooks I've seen are for rooms, scenes, dungeon mini-maps, dungeon maps for the pause menu, text, scene processing, and ROM loading. Although, you can technically replace almost anything except sound and music, including NPCs and NPC code, for example. But the 64DD hook system felt badly planned for new features. Not impossible to implement new features, but oddly more complicated than it could have been designed. Miyamoto did say he wanted to expand on Hyrule's NPCs, but it seems that ambition was ultimately pursued in Majora's Mask rather than in Ura. Speaking of which, early versions of the Swamp Spider House and Beneath the Well were also found in Ura's leaked files, which led to more rumors that they were originally created for Ura, but got repurposed for Majora's Mask. But those files were added to Ura in May 2000 after Majora had already released in Japan, so it seems they were also just for testing purposes and never actually meant for inclusion in Ura Zelda. This was a pretty complicated section, so here's the general takeaway. Nintendo designed the hooks to be capable of much more than just remixed dungeons. So some features were actually in development and discussed publicly by Miyamoto after he had already finished making Ocarina, like mask customization and online connectivity. In that sense, you could say Ura Zelda really was more than Master Quest. But a lot of the rumors and fan expectations of what Ura Zelda should have been, like unfreezing Zoro's domain and outracing the Running Man, were just fake. They were never promised by Nintendo, and there's no evidence they were ever in development. And as a side note, while we're talking about the Running Man, during our research we actually found out why you can't beat him in Ocarina. And that's probably a good way to end today's video. In the April '99 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine, the interviewer asks point blank, why can't you outrace the Running Man? Ocarina's map data manager, Shigeo Kimura, takes the question and explains, quote, "The Running Man seems like someone you can beat, but you can't. That effectively makes him Link's greatest rival in Hyrule. In a way, he's even more powerful than Ganon. But really, the reason's because we didn't have anything to give the player as a reward for beating him. So there's your answer to the great mystery. The devs don't let you beat him because they didn't have anything special to give you. I guess they didn't want to give us another huge rupee."
A few months after Link's Awakening was re-released with some updates on the Game Boy Color, Capcom producer Yoshiki Okamoto approached Miyamoto about remaking Zelda 1 in the style of Link's Awakening. Perhaps wanting to avoid a repeat of the CDI debacle, Miyamoto blew him off, but Okamoto refused to take no for an answer, threatening to produce a rip-off if Miyamoto didn't say yes. In a 1999 interview with German magazine Total, Okamoto explained how the Trilogy project came into existence. He said, "I especially like the Zelda on Famicom, but Nintendo just wasn't interested in translating it onto the Game Boy Color. So I told Mr. Miyamoto that I wanted to produce the game, but nothing ever came of it, so I had to threaten him." The magazine, probably shocked, asked him to repeat himself. "You threatened him?" "I said if Nintendo doesn't want to do it, Capcom will make an identical game, but just change the name of the game and all the characters." Then he asked if we wanted to develop the game legitimately. We immediately accepted. Eventually, a deal was struck that after the remake was complete, Capcom would follow it up with a trilogy of brand new games called the Triforce series. As producer, Okamoto was meant to supervise the remake's development, but ended up spending most of his time overseas, so the project was led by Capcom director Hidemaru Fujibayashi. If that name sounds familiar, it's because after the partnership between Capcom and Nintendo was dissolved, Fujibayashi was hired to work directly for Nintendo and later served as director on Breath of the Wild, and is currently directing its sequel. In many ways, Breath of the Wild was a reimagining of Zelda 1, but at the time, Fujibayashi wasn't as enthusiastic about remaking Zelda 1 as his boss Okamoto. The Capcom team felt Zelda 1 was too difficult for the modern generation of gamers, so they ended up scrapping the remake and skipping ahead to development of the Triforce series. According to Miyamoto, the Tale of Power was originally planned to launch in late 1999 and focus on action, followed up a few months later with the puzzle-based Tale of Wisdom, and then a few months after that, the trilogy would conclude with the Tale of Courage. All three games would be connected with passwords, so after completing one game, fans could continue their adventure in the next installment. It was expected that fans would play the trilogy in the order they were released, but they were being developed in a way that fans could play the games in any order they wanted. The Triforce series was initially planned to make use of the mobile system GB, a service that allowed fans to connect a Game Boy Color to the internet by using a cell phone adapter. Miyamoto said, "The original idea for those games was for them to be more episodic in content, and the development actually started with the notion of potentially trying to sell dungeons individually. Linking all three games together proved too much for the team, however, so Okamoto made more than just a call for help. He had to send out an SOS for Miyamoto to ride in on a white horse and save the trilogy from development hell. To get the project back on course, Miyamoto cut the series from 3 games down to just 2, and any ideas involving online features were thrown out as well. The games were temporarily rebranded as the Mysterious Seeds series, but in the end, the Tale of Power became Oracle Seasons, and the Tale of Wisdom became Oracle of Ages. After more than a year of delays, instead of releasing episodically, the games finally launched together in February 2001. Bits and pieces of the cancelled Zelda 1 remake found their way into Seasons. Both games have a western graveyard, and the first dungeon can be found inside a dead tree on a small island, and even the dungeons' internal layouts are similar. 6 of Seasons' dungeon bosses were also taken from Zelda 1. As for the Tale of Courage, also known as the Mystical Seed of Courage, it's impossible to know exactly how much made its way into Oracle of Ages and Seasons, but in addition to the online features, we do know a few more pieces of the puzzle that got left out. The 2 games that survived made use of magic items called the Harp of Ages and the Rod of Seasons, while concept art revealed in the Hyrule Historia suggests the last game in the trilogy was planned around the magic paintbrush, an item that would have taken full advantage of the Game Boy Color. The Oracle Nairu plays a central role in Ages, and Din stars in Seasons, while the 3rd game was originally planned to feature Furori. Since the game was never finished, Furori ended up with just a small token role in Ages and Seasons, essentially as a password clerk in the Hall of Secrets. Some websites claim that Capcom was also planning to remake Zelda 2 for the Game Boy Color, but we couldn't find any credible evidence to support that claim, even after talking to Okamoto himself. So it appears the idea of Capcom remaking Zelda 2 was nothing more than a rumor. Did you know? There's over 30 known Super Mario games that never saw the light of day. In this video, we'll be going through them all, with some exceptions. We'll leave out games that were rumored to exist but have no reputable proof that they were real, like Mario Kart VB, a reputed Mario Kart game for the Virtual Boy, as well as games that were just earlier versions of release titles, like Super Mario RPG 2, an early title for Paper Mario. We'll also be leaving out games in the Donkey Kong franchise, unless they're related to the original DK arcade title which Mario first appeared in. But let's get to it. One of the most mysterious games on our list is Mario's Planet Quest. In July of 2021, Andrew Borman, digital games curator at the previously mentioned Strong Museum of Play, uncovered a game called Mario's Planet Quest listed on the resume of a former Software Toolworks developer. The only information given was that it was developed for the Super Nintendo and was an educational game similar to Mario's Time Machine, which the developer also listed on their resume. Given the title, it's a safe bet that the game would have revolved around Mario traveling to space and learning about the solar system, clicking on objects for more information. Software Toolworks composer Mark Knight lists a similar game on his website called Mario's Mission Earth, which is likely the same game as the one uncovered by Borman. Super Mario's Wacky Worlds was a platform game developed by Nova Logic for the ill-fated Philips CDI console. Planned as a successor to Super Mario World, the game follows Mario as he treks through jungles, castles, cities, ancient Greece, and ancient Egypt. As you can see from the unfinished prototype that was dumped online, the game is very rudimentary, with Mario being unable to swim, collect power-ups, or be hurt by enemies. Comanche developer Nova Logic made an early one-level demo of the game in under 2 weeks, with programmers Silas Warner of Castle Wolfenstein fame and John Brooks leading the project. After getting approval from Philips, the group continued their work, aiming to create something that stayed true to the series. However, due to several staff leaving the company and the poor sales of the CDI, Wacky Worlds was scrapped. In an interview with researcher Frank Gasking for the book The Games That Weren't, Nova Logic artist Nina Stanley said, "I think the real reason that Wacky Worlds was cancelled was due to changes in personnel. The lead engineer on the project, John Brooks, decided to leave and work for EA. When a replacement programmer wasn't found to continue the project, I also left and went to EA, and the game was ultimately cancelled." According to Stanley, around 80% of the art and 30% of the programming were completed before production halted. At least 4 prototypes of Wacky Worlds are known to exist, with one being sold on eBay in 2002 for over $1,000. Another unreleased game for the CDI is Mario Takes America. Around 1994, Toronto-based developer Sigum Entertainment pitched an educational title starring Mario to Philips, where he traveled across the United States to learn more about places like New York, Niagara Falls, and Hollywood. The game would have featured live-action FMV of these locations, with a 2D Mario rendered over it Roger Rabbit style. The live-action backgrounds took up most of the game's memory, making it a hard project for the programmers, one of which reportedly left Sigum fewer than 3 weeks after being hired. While doing research for this video, Did You Know Gaming was able to get in touch with animation director Michael Borthwick, who told us a little more about the game's production. Borthwick told us, "Many sequences were done, but it was taking very long to get things working properly as the machine really could not handle what we were trying to do." Sigum founder Howard Greenspan likely failed to realize the limits of the machine right off the bat and kept over-promising the look and playability of the game to Philips. For example, we had a full 12-frame Mario walk cycle that had to be reduced to 6 frames because the CDI player could not handle playing 12 frames plus video plus collision detection plus the other sprites. Late in development, Sigum tried creating a backup game that replaced Mario with Sonic the Hedgehog. A second backup game was also made with 2 original characters, a rock and roll duo named Heavy and Metal. Not impressed by their work, Philips cut all funding, and the game was quickly cancelled. Sigum would file for bankruptcy in 1994, and most of the company's assets were repossessed by the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. Around late 1994, Argonaut Software pitched a 3D platforming game for the Super Nintendo titled Yoshi Racing. An unidentified artist at the company created a non-playable demo of the dinosaur running around an obstacle course, which would have used the same super effects technology seen in games like Star Fox and Stunt Race FX. Argonaut co-founder Jez Sand sent videos of the demo to Nintendo hoping for approval, but much to his dismay, they got rejected. Along with the recent cancellation of Star Fox 2, this response is considered a stake in Argonaut's departure from the company. A few years later, Nintendo would come out with a 3D platformer of their own, Super Mario 64. In a 2013 Eurogamer article, Sand alleged that Nintendo borrowed the 3D platforming concept from Argonaut, claiming that Shigeru Miyamoto thanked him for the idea at a trade show. It is unknown how accurate this claim is, as no one other than Sand and Miyamoto would be able to confirm it. In 1997, Argonaut released an original 3D platformer for Windows, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn, Croc, Legend of the Gobos. Rumors have circulated that Yoshi was the inspiration for Croc's design. Lead designer Nick Cusworth refutes this, saying that Croc's appearance came from a series of doodles by Argonaut IT member Simon Simon Keating. In July of 2020, shortly following the infamous Nintendo Giga leak on 4chan, a single Super FX model of Yoshi was found deep within its files. Contrary to popular belief, this model had zero relation to Yoshi Racing and was likely used for a different project entirely. At the 1995 Winter Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, a tech demo was unveiled for the then-new Virtual Boy, called Mario Bros. VB. The single-level demo had 3 different modes: a side-scroller where you could move between the background and the foreground like in Virtual Boy Wario Land, a top-down dungeon section similar to the Legend of Zelda series, and a mini-game identical to the original Mario Bros. Arcade title. Despite receiving high praise at the show and getting good coverage in magazines like GamePro and EGM, Mario Bros. VB never got shown again. It's unknown as to why the game was cancelled, or if it progressed any further than the CES demo. Some have theorized that the demo eventually evolved into Mario Clash for the Virtual Boy, but this is yet to be confirmed by Nintendo. In 2016, video game preservation website Nintendo Player released an article discussing an odd concept art piece from their collection. The art was a 5-panel storyboard of Mario running through what looked like to be ruins of a building. Mario steps over a stone slab, which suddenly sprouts eyes and legs, turning into a womp-like creature. Little was known about the storyboard until Nintendo Player tracked down the original owner to a man named Patrick Michael Clark, former lead artist at the now-defunct Redmond-based Boss Game Studios. After contacting another dev at Boss Game, Nintendo Player confirmed Patrick's board was drawn in the mid to late 90s for a pitch that died on the vine after Nintendo saw the concept art. Following this failed project, Boss Game Studios would begin making third-party games for the Nintendo 64, including Top Gear Rally and Stunt Racer 64. The company shut its doors in 2002, following issues finding publishers for their future titles. Years before the Game Boy Advance, there was a Game Boy successor in the works codenamed Project Atlantis. Nintendo collaborated with Advanced Risk Machines, or ARM, to develop a 32-bit handheld that reportedly used a 160 MHz processor, 4 buttons, and a color LCD screen. In the April 1996 issue of EGM, news of the system was followed by a rumor that Nintendo was working on a game called Mario's Castle, potentially the Atlantis' launch title. However, other than this single blurb in EGM, no mention of Mario's Castle exists publicly. Even if it did exist, it's unlikely that any work was done on it aside from a few rough ideas on paper. Masato Kuwahara, project leader on the DSi, revealed in a 2009 Game Developers Conference talk that Nintendo wasn't satisfied with Atlantis' graphics performance and so scrapped the project entirely. Mario's Castle did not get referenced during the Kuwahara-san GDC discussion, which further supports the theory that production did not go very far, or perhaps even start. One of the few cancelled games starring Mario's arch-rival Wario would be Wario Pool for the Game Boy Color. In 2001, veteran British developers Nick Pelling and Jeff Ferguson pitched a pool billiards game to Nintendo featuring the titular antihero. Little was known about the pitch until Pelling released a short video on his website, giving us a small glimpse of the game's plot. Late one stormy night, Wario receives a phone call from his manager asking if he'll be in the yearly pool championships. Wario says no. Suddenly, 2 literal pool sharks appear on TV, scoffing that nobody, not even Wario, can beat them at pool. Now furious, Wario decides to join the championships. According to Nick Pelling, despite getting rejected by Nintendo, the Wario Pool engine wasn't wasted. It was retooled and used for the Game Boy Color game 3D Pocket Pool, released only in Europe. We did it. We got our hands on a lost Pokemon game, and we're leaking it in today's video. Not only are you going to see it in action, we're also going to show how you can play it for yourself. Maybe leak is the wrong word. We actually got it legit from one of the developers, so technically it's more like we're dumping it, along with all the raw files and concept art. But first, we're going to cover the full history of every cancelled game in the series. Pokemon Pink, Pokemon Picross, Pinball DS, enhanced editions of Fire Red and Leaf Green, and a couple more. We'll cover them all in chronological order, except the one we're dumping, because we want to save the best for last. A couple quick caveats before we get started though. First, not all these games were technically cancelled. Every game had unique circumstances, but cancelled is a close enough blanket term we're using for games that never made it to store shelves. Some were more like failed pitches at Nintendo, while others were 100% finished but got locked away in a vault. Also, we're not going to cover Meowth's Party or Pikachu DS because they were just tech demos created to show off the capabilities of the GameCube and DS, and were never meant to become full games. We're not covering Pocket Monsters 64 either, since its supposed existence seems to be based on decades-old misunderstandings from fans who thought a full Pokemon RPG was in the works for N64, but in reality that game was just Pokemon Stadium. Okay, with all that said and the intro out of the way, let's start off by dissecting Pokemon Pink, which it appears Game Freak planned to release alongside Pokemon Yellow in 1998. In other words, Pokemon Pink and Yellow would have been paired releases, just like Red and Green. Fans had no idea about Pink until April 2020, when source code for Blue and Yellow leaked on 4chan. There were all kinds of interesting finds in the code, like unused Pokemon sprites, and audio files showing pretty much every Pokemon was intended to say its name. All those voices got cut, probably because they were cursed, so in the final game, the only Pokemon who talks is Pikachu. The source code also contained a couple references to a non-existent Pokemon game, like a header for, quote, Pocket Monsters Pink and Yellow. Notice how Pink comes first. There's another line that mentions Pink and Yellow packages. For comparison, here's what the equivalent code looks like in earlier games. Basically identical, except it says Red and Green packages. To explain packages in layman's terms, Red and Green are both built from the same source code, but which package identifier gets ticked determines which game you can play on a Game Boy cartridge. If the Red package is ticked, the game boots up as Pokemon Red. So all signs point to Pink and Yellow being another paired release, and in that regard, you could say Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee are their spiritual successors. We talked to the cutting room floor admin Huguette Hikari to explain technical details, and she said they experimented with changing the package from yellow to pink to see if it'd magically unlock a lost Pokemon game. Unfortunately, and unsurprisingly, it didn't work, but it was worth a shot. We can't say for certain, but it appears Pokemon Pink was likely scrapped very early in development, since these two lines of code are the only evidence of its existence. The Pokemon companies only mentioned Pokemon Pink in one interview, and we'll get to that in a minute, but without more info from them or Game Freak, it's impossible to say how Pink would have been different from Yellow. Presumably, the game and a lot of the sprites would have had a pink palette. Some fans believe Jigglypuff would have appeared on the game's box art, considering its prominent role in the anime, and that Pikachu and Jigglypuff were the only two Pokemon fighters in the original Super Smash Bros. Like maybe those two were chosen for Smash because at the time they were set to star in 2 upcoming Pokemon games. But the most popular theory is that Clefairy would have been the star, because the Japanese version of the Game Boy camera had this frame of Pikachu and Clefairy together, which got removed from later international releases, but more importantly because the 1996 Pocket Monster manga that predates the anime starred Clefairy and Trainer Red. Some fans speculate that while Pokemon Yellow uses elements from the anime, like a Pikachu partner, Team Rocket, Nurse Joy, or Officer Jenny, Pokemon Pink would have been more like the manga, and also maybe cater more to female fans, which was an explicit priority for the franchise at the time. After the leak dropped on 4chan, 4chaners started making a Pokemon Pink ROM hack to bring that vision to life with a female player character, but ultimately it was never finished. The Pokemon Company never addressed the leak. We did, however, find one instance where the words Pokemon Pink crossed the lips of company president Tsunekazu Ishihara. In a Japanese interview from 2000 we had translated, Ishihara and series creator Satoshi Tajiri explained Gen 1 and 2's development. We'll make the full translation publicly available, linked below if you want to read it. Regarding Pink though, he says, quote, We made Red and Green, then after that we made Blue. Later we made Yellow, and it might have been nice if the next games were called Pink or Purple, but if we did that, all we'd be doing is perpetually making extensions of the originals. In context, he's explaining why the next games were called Gold and Silver, so they could keep using colors while also signaling to customers that Gen 2 is more impressive than Gen 1. But Ishihara's sentiment that Pink or Purple might have just been perpetually making extensions of the originals might also apply to why Pink got cancelled, because there were already 4 versions of Gen 1, and a 5th version would have been overkill. Not just for the fans, but also for Game Freak. They needed to devote more resources to making Gen 2, which ended up releasing 2 years behind schedule, even without getting slowed down making Pink. Maybe we're reading too much into that quote, but regardless, that was indeed the situation. The most pessimistic view was voiced by Huguette Hikari, who said it's possible Pink was never anything at all, not even an idea. A lot of source code was copy-pasted to make Yellow, so maybe Game Freak's programmers just deleted the words Red and Green and replaced them with Pink and Yellow without much thought. If that's really all that happened, Pokemon fans have spent the last few years theorizing about nothing. And somewhere out there, Ishihara's laughing his ass off at our expense. Hopefully not, though, and someday he'll reveal a big binder about Pink on Japanese TV, like he did a few years back with all those Kapumon sprites. Next up is a game we can say with 100% certainty did exist because the full game leaked online 2 decades after it was cancelled, playable from start to finish, even the credits. Pokemon Picross was a Game Boy Color puzzler first announced in Japanese magazines in 1999, which showed off screenshots and some original artwork. The game was developed by Jupiter Corporation, the same guys who made the Pokemon Pinball spin-offs, or at least the 2 pinball games that didn't get cancelled. More on that later. Jupiter created the Picross series a few years earlier, and it sold well enough that they released about 40 more Picross games up to the present day. They've crossed over with Mario and Zelda, and briefly with Pokemon in Picross NP Volume 1, a Super Famicom game only available via the Japanese Nintendo Power Service. But there was also a full Pokemon game that slipped through the cracks. Picross's gameplay is kinda hard to explain and we don't want to bore you, so simply put, it's kinda like Minesweeper, or Sudoku with less math. If you're interested in learning, Pokemon Picross comes with a tutorial taught by Professor Oak, and after the leak, the community took it upon themselves to release an English fan translation. The game's got an original 23-piece soundtrack. That's what you're hearing now. In addition to Oak, it's got Pikachu, Misty, Team Rocket, locations all around Kanto, and lots of anime references. You can also get Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle as partner Pokemon, which change the border colors to green, red, and blue. Interestingly, you can also get Clefairy and Jigglypuff as partner Pokemon, which changes the border to pink or purple. Pink or purple? Anyway, it's a good little puzzle game and pretty addictive. In 2015, Jupiter released a different Pokemon Picross game for 3DS that got pretty good review scores. Unfortunately, it was digital only, so nowadays it's impossible to download on your 3DS, since Nintendo shut down the eShop in 2023. You can catch both games online though, if you're up for sailing the high seas. Not that we condone piracy, of course. For this last game, we just want to say right off the bat, it's been designated lost media for years, but we restored it. And as of today, it's been added to the Internet Archive. It ain't lost media anymore, and you can play it right now if you like. We'll talk about that more in a minute, but first let's look at the game itself. Pokemon 2000 Adventure was an officially licensed game that ended up being better than Nintendo expected it to be when they signed the contract, so they shut it down. But by then, 1 million people had already played it. The history on this one is pretty unique. The second Pokemon movie, called Pokemon the Movie 2000, was distributed in America by Warner Bros. Along with the movie, Nintendo fully licensed and gave permission for Warner Bros. To create promotional materials to sell more tickets. Nintendo were probably expecting posters, art, trailers, and maybe cheap web games, like Pikachu-themed Tic-Tac-Toe. But they weren't expecting Warner Bros. To spend millions producing a 3D Pokemon game. But that's exactly what Warner Bros. Did. They contracted a studio called Cyberworld, who previously made virtual shopping malls, a Harry Potter game, and various other 3-dimensional experiences. Think of them like Doom. 3D spaces populated with 2D sprites, but running in an internet browser. Pretty impressive back in the 90s. Warner Bros. Wanted to use this cutting-edge technology to promote the new Pokemon movie. We talked to Eddie Ruminski, one of Cyberworld's developers.
We launched it and we had about 1 million downloads in the span of a month, which was our most popular game to date. And that's when Nintendo freaked. And they immediately hit us with a cease and desist. They thought Warner Brothers breached the contract. They exceeded the contract's allowable scope, basically. Nintendo didn't expect that promotion to include something that was legitimately a video game.
Back then, the only 3D Pokemon games that existed were Pokemon Snap and Pokemon Stadium. So Nintendo thought fans would see this first-person adventure and think it was a new direction the series was headed in. They considered it a threat and were concerned it would cause brand confusion. Eddie was sort of a junior programmer at the time, but he was the only guy at Cyberworld familiar with Pokemon. The company got a pre-release of Pokemon the Movie 2000, sat Eddie in front of it, and asked, "How the hell do we turn this into a video game?" After they bounced some ideas back and forth with Warner Bros., here's what they came up with. What you're watching now is one of our playthroughs of Pokemon 2000 Adventure. The music you're hearing is the game soundtrack. The game begins with Professor Oak telling you there's a disturbance in the Force, and you've got to investigate. Then you pick one of 3 Pokemon teams, and a difficulty: beginner, intermediate, or advanced. Now your adventure begins, exploring 3 islands in any order you want. Your path forward is sometimes blocked by environmental obstacles that require Pokemon's special abilities to get past, like these volcanic lava plumes for example. On our playthrough, we used Poliwhirl's water gun to extinguish the flames. Then he got experience points and evolved into Poliwrath. Eventually, we found Moltres. It asked us a trivia question about Lavender Town, and after we got it right, Moltres gave us a red ancient sphere. Then, on the next island, we used Lapras to freeze a lake and walk across it, melted an ice barrier with Vulpix, and answered Articuno's trivia question to get another sphere. On the final island, we cleared out some electric barriers and evolved a couple more Pokemon, and got the final sphere from Zapdos. Then Professor Oak thanked us for saving the world and awarded us a certificate for beating the game. You can also get a final score and gold, silver, or bronze ranking, depending on how well you did. The game's only about 10 minutes, but there's some replayability thanks to having 3 Pokemon teams and 3 difficulty settings to choose from. By the time Nintendo struck down the game, the devs had already got paid, they got to see the movie before it hit theaters, and they got to say they'd worked on a massively successful Pokemon game.
It was the greatest compliment via cease and desist, saying, sorry, what you made was too much like a good video game. At the end of the day, when it was pulled, it was more like, we've already been paid. Like, that was a $2 million deal for that to make that game. Once it was pulled, it was like, we did the work, it was great, it was really popular. We hit the 1 million downloads that we didn't even dream of to begin with. So when it was pulled, we were all happy.
Warner Brothers was happy too. With 1 million downloads, they got more promotion than they were expecting, and Pokemon 2000 went on to become the second highest grossing Japanese movie to ever hit American theaters. So really, everyone was happy except Nintendo. And if you want to play the game yourself, you'll be happy too, because here's directions on how you can play it right now. Eddie's been holding on to the raw files for the past 23 years. Then after he saw our video about restoring Pokemon Garden, he reached out and sent us all the files. One of the Pokemon Garden archivists, Rufus 10, and his friend Doomtay did some computer magic to get it working on the modern internet, which was a lot harder than it sounds. All credit goes to those guys. We were just sort of middlemen in the back and forth. We won't bore you with the technical restoration details, but like we said, it ain't lost media anymore. Go play it if you want. Might want to be quick about it though, just in case Nintendo strikes it down again. For preservation's sake, we also archived the game's concept art, storyboards, soundtrack, and all the raw files. So even if it does get struck down, it'll always survive somewhere on the internet.
Did you know? Before making the critically acclaimed Grand Theft Auto series, Rockstar North was developing games for Nintendo. In the early 90s, Rockstar, then known as DMA Design, was one of Nintendo's top second-party developers, making titles for the Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64. Among these games was a top-secret project starring one of Nintendo's most recognizable characters. Intended to release on the SNES in 1995, Kid Kirby was a spin-off where players follow Kirby in his first adventure through Dreamland. The game was intended for an even younger audience than Kirby, somehow, and was in production for years, constantly switching its style and staff. Although relatively far in development, the game was cancelled by Nintendo for various reasons, and DMA moved on to other projects, eventually parting ways with Nintendo altogether. Despite being part of such an iconic series, there's very little documentation on Kid Kirby online. ROMs of the game have yet to surface, and the only direct coverage of Kid Kirby in the press was a tiny blurb in a Mexican magazine. So today we'll be discussing the game in its entirety, how it got made, why it was scrapped, and how it may have had an impact on DMA's future titles. Did You Know Gaming has managed to get a hold of several ex-DMA developers involved in the project, and they gave us some valuable insight. Unfortunately, however, none of them have kept any form of ROM, source code, or artwork from the project. So, to help illustrate the game's visuals, we're working with professional game artist Sean Hicks to recreate what could have been, creating accurate mock-ups based on the developers' descriptions. And we'll credit this in the corner so you know what we commissioned and what's from the actual game. Through extensive interviews and hours of internet sleuthing, here is the story of Kid Kirby, the lost Nintendo game from the twisted minds of GTA. Before we go any further, we should explain where Rockstar North, and by extension DMA Design, came from. Once you know the roots, Rockstar developing a Kirby game isn't as crazy as it sounds. DMA Design officially began in 1987 in a 2-room office above a baby supply shop in Scotland. Founder Dave Jones, a gifted electronics engineer from the city of Dundee, was interested in computing since the late 70s. According to Jones, there was only one computer in his entire school, and he spent as much time as possible on it, much to the dismay of his teachers. However, by the early 80s, home computers became much more accessible in Europe with the rise of systems like the ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64. Jones often hung out at the Dundee Computer Club, where he'd meet 3 other programmers, Mike Daly, Steve Hammond, and Russell Kay. The 4 became good friends and began designing small games for 8-bit computers. After losing his job at a manufacturing plant right out of high school, Jones used his £3,000 severance package, about $15,000 USD in today's money, to buy a state-of-the-art Amiga computer. He began working on his first big game, Menace. A fast-paced arcade shooter, Menace was released by major British publisher Psygnosis in 1988. Before finishing the game, Jones sought to create an actual studio after realizing literally none existed in Dundee. The name he settled on, DMA Design, was taken from Amiga programming manuals, where it stood for Direct Memory Access. In Jones's case, it meant Direct Mind Access, though over time, DMA would eventually come to mean doesn't mean anything. Jones quickly began employing his friends from the computer club, and DMA's second title, a spiritual successor to Menace called Blood Money, would release in 1989. Money started to pool into the tiny studio, and Jones dropped out of university to concentrate on DMA full-time. DMA's first major success came not from another space shooter, but a cutesy puzzle strategy game for the Amiga. Lemmings, released in February 1991, had the player guide a gaggle of anthropomorphic lemmings through a series of dangerous caverns. To complete a level, the player must give each lemming, which are constantly moving around the stage, a specific task that will help them avoid any upcoming obstacles. The lemmings can dig, build a staircase, climb walls, and if push comes to shove, self-destruct. Lemmings was a smash hit, selling 55,000 copies in its first day, and opening the gates for dozens of ports. DMA earned more than £1.5 million from the game, about 5 million USD in today's money. And Jones, then only 25 years old, was becoming one of the wealthiest game designers in Europe. The crazy success of Lemmings eventually caught the eye of Nintendo, who wanted to give Jones and his company the contract of a lifetime. While the Nintendo 64, then codenamed Project Reality, was on the horizon, Nintendo started what was known as the Dream Team. In early 1994, they signed several developers and publishers outside of Japan for the 64's launch in North America. Some studios attached included Silicon Graphics, Acclaim, Williams, and Rare. DMA Design, now housing about 36 employees in a swanky upgraded office, was announced as part of the Dream Team on May 2nd. Months prior, DMA went to Nintendo at a trade show, presenting them with something thought impossible. Using a clip from Star Wars, the company proved that full-screen video compression was possible on the SNES. The demo impressed Nintendo so much that they invested hugely in DMA, giving them tons of equipment like a $34,000 Silicon Graphics machine. Nintendo was also impressed with their work on home computers, and particularly their creative decisions in game design. Lemmings, a family-friendly, cartoony, gameplay-rich title, is exactly the kind of game Nintendo likes. We think Dave Jones is one of the very few people in the world that are in the Spielberg category. Howard Lincoln, then chairman at Nintendo of America, told the press, "His software ideas are incredible." DMA signed a multi-million-pound contract to develop 2 games for the Nintendo 64. The studio also began doing titles for the Super Nintendo. And because of their newfound relationship, DMA decided to reskin a rudimentary SNES game with an original IP into one with a recognizable Nintendo character. The small Scottish studio would become the first developer outside of Japan to work on the Kirby franchise. This was the beginning of Kid Kirby. In the 80s and 90s, there was a trend of taking older, established franchises and babifying the characters for a younger audience. If you lived during this time, you might remember things like Tiny Toon Adventures, Muppet Babies, and Nintendo's own Baby Mario in Yoshi's Island. Kid Kirby would not be dissimilar to these spin-offs. The game's plot is told from the perspective of an older Kirby who's retelling the story of his first adventure. We open on the DMA logo embossed into the cover of Kirby's storybook. The book opens up, revealing a title card and the opening cutscene. We see Baby Kirby, prominently featured with a long, curly string of hair on his head, waking up from his crib in the middle of the night. He hears a strange noise outside and goes to investigate. He discovers that the Star Rod, the item that keeps Dreamland alive, has gone missing, so now it's up to Kirby to find the magical wand and save the day. Were it to be released, Kid Kirby would have been one of the unique titles compatible with the SNES mouse. Bundled initially with Mario Paint, the mouse was mostly used for puzzle games, art software, and simulations, so it was rare for a platformer to have this kind of peripheral support. In Kid Kirby, the mouse controls a large cartoon glove, serving as a boost for Baby Kirby. Holding the left button, you can pull back Kirby's hair and slingshot him across the level. The further you pulled back, the further Kirby would fly. Think of it as an early version of Angry Birds. When Kirby is mid-air, you can either slap him higher up, essentially doing a double jump, or slam him toward the ground onto the enemies below. Of course, a Kirby game would not be complete without copy abilities. Tapping the right button would activate a power-up obtained from an enemy you recently killed. The stone power, previously seen in Kirby's Adventure, would return in this game, allowing Kirby to turn into a rock and crush his enemies with his weight. There were also plenty of original ideas for power-ups. Kirby could turn into a paper airplane and glide across the level. He could even put on a pair of sticky shoes and stick himself to a wall. Kirby is similar to the titular characters in Lemmings, constantly moving around with a mind of his own. The player essentially serves as a babysitter, a literal helping hand keeping Kirby out of trouble. The goal of Kid Kirby is to collect the lost stars scattered across each world. Once you collect them all, you throw Kirby through a hoop and progress to the next level. There is also an option for a 2-player mode, where the screen is split in half and 2 players race side by side. Kid Kirby consisted of 120 levels, about 60 of which formed the main body of the game. The remaining 60 could be accessed via a hidden door on one of the levels. According to programmer James Watson, who shared his memories of the game in a 2008 forum post, the door was hidden within a large bell. Fun fact, finishing each level would add 1% to the completion counter, and a perfect score required you to beat the game by 120%. Most of the classic bosses from the franchise would return here. Wispy Woods, as always, would be the first boss. King DDD, now a mere prince, would serve as the main antagonist. Enemies included Waddle Dees, Waddle Doos, and Bronto Burt. In researching this video, we contacted one of the many artists who worked at DMA in the mid-90s. This person, who chose to remain anonymous, was one of the original artists on Kid Kirby, where they helped design 3D renders of the enemies and bosses. As well as Wispy Woods, they modeled a Buckethead boss and a Sea Anemone boss. Whether these bosses were original creations by DMA or pre-existing concepts sent over by Nintendo is unknown. After talking to some Kirby experts, we weren't able to find any similar bosses, and the artist, unfortunately, has no memory of what the bosses' actual names were. Before working on Kid Kirby, the developers at DMA had a mixed relationship with the pink puffball. Some people, like our anonymous artist, were well aware of the franchise, being fans of titles like Kirby's Dream Course and the original Dreamland. Others were the opposite. Programmer Patrick Kerr, who joined the project in May 1995, was initially unaware that Kirby was an existing IP. I hadn't owned any Nintendo stuff because you couldn't program it. I had come from a home computing background and didn't even know what Kirby was when I started. Looking to learn more about the franchise, Steve Hammond, one of the original DMA employees, contacted Nintendo of America for some background information. In return, he received a Monster Facts, which contained character sheets and manuals from previous games. This let Hammond develop a massive internal document called the Unofficial Kirby Reference Book for Westerners. It was a helpful resource for both himself and other DMA employees. Hammond was tasked with writing the game's manual, which laid out the story in a compelling yet humorous manner. The manual was littered with Hammond's own sketches of Kirby, who spoke in an alien language that could only be read as pieces of fruit. This was a reference to classic Marvel comics, where the writers would translate indecipherable languages for the reader's sake. It should be noted that production on Kid Kirby was happening during a hectic time at DMA. Numerous projects across different consoles were concurrently ongoing, and each team consisted of less than 10 core people, often working on several projects at a time. Jones's idea was to try different things, knowing that hits were rare but highly valuable when achieved. At the same time as Kirby, the studio was focused on developing 2 games for the N64, one of which, Body Harvest, was originally intended as a launch title and was a top priority to Nintendo. Shigeru Miyamoto would often visit the offices in Dundee to consult on various projects. Although Body Harvest was his main concern, Miyamoto always made time for Kirby. He had witnessed an earlier iteration of the game and wanted to add more richness to its playability. Pat Kerr recalls that the power-ups, the paper airplane, the rock, and the sticky shoes, may have been Miyamoto's suggestions, though we could not fully confirm this. Nintendo of America had some input as well. The original Prince DDD design was one of the things faxed over to Steve Hammond, hence why it looks so, different compared to the other renders. I don't think any of our guys would have put out something that ugly. In an interview with Next Generation magazine, Jones described DMA's relationship with Nintendo. It's fine. It's hard. It's a very hard relationship because their quality is so high that it's so hard to match the quality of the products they do. And they really want you to focus on making Nintendo products. It's very hard to write games that you're not writing for yourself, which is traditionally what I've done. I write a game because I want to play it. It's a big difference when you try and write a game for somebody else. It's really hard to do. Kid Kirby was scheduled for release around October 1995, but was in development as far back as 1993. It should be made clear that the Kirby license wasn't always attached. The initial concept came from Tony Colgan, a freelance programmer who previously worked for DMA in the late 80s. Colgan's original pitch was a golf game, the idea being that you could pull the mouse back and strike the ball, shooting through any obstacles that may exist in a 2-dimensional plane. Colgan presented Jones with a prototype and was quickly offered a full-time job at the company. It was decided early on that the golf theme should be scrapped and replaced with something more creative, something more DMA. The game had been renamed Jellies. This version had the player control a gelatinous blob with a mind of its own. The goal was to stretch the jelly out and ping them off in any direction, forcing them to land on a series of platforms and escape the level. Bugaboo, the Flea, a ZX Spectrum game from 1983, was a major influence in its design. As part of the early Dream Team negotiations in February 1994, Jellies got exposed to Nintendo, who thought the game would be a good addition to the Kirby franchise, and DMA agreed. The biggest changes afterwards were its visuals. Early on, the game had a more flat aesthetic, with levels built out of large, single-colored blocks. Kirby was initially a tiny 16x16 sprite, but his size grew as the game progressed. At a certain point, Kirby and all the enemies and bosses were redesigned with pre-rendered graphics, and the levels were changed to have a pseudo-3D feel. This change likely happened following the release of Donkey Kong Country, which used pre-rendered graphics on the SNES in a similar manner. In 2007, Mike Daly, another Day One DMA employee, released several Kid Kirby maps and sprites onto his personal Flickr account. The post has since been removed, but is still easily accessible online. The maps give us a good idea as to what kind of levels would have been in the game. There's a cavern, a castle, and a possible boss battle at the Fountain of Dreams. There's also a factory stage with moving girders, as well as a snow level where you'd push through ice blocks to get to the finish. Speaking with Pat Kerr, we confirmed that most of this art was used in the earlier 2D iterations and does not represent the final product. Only two maps, Tube 9 and Sewer 9, would have been included in the pseudo-3D versions. These were the backgrounds we chose to use in our mockups. As the first people outside of Japan to lead production on a Kirby game, the developers had a lot of responsibility. The staff consisted of about 5 programmers, 3 artists, and a single musician. After going through several changes, the game was nearly finished by early 1996. Unfortunately, various complications prevented the game from hitting store shelves. Due to the nature of the controls, Kid Kirby ideally would have been packaged with the SNES mouse. However, due to the SNES nearing the end of its life cycle, it was decided the game should be cancelled. Increasingly poor sales of the mouse meant it'd be too expensive to consider releasing. Had it been completed earlier, it could have seen the light of day, but development went much slower than intended, repeatedly being delayed. Things like the basic collision system were far behind schedule, and with so many projects underway, DMA producers didn't have much time to consult. For many people, Kid Kirby was their first professional project. Some programmers and artists were right out of university and lacked the experience that could have pushed the game forward. Tony Colgan, essentially Kid Kirby's director, would be let go near the end of development. This meant it was up to Pat Kerr and programmer Stuart Hunt to complete any unfinished business. Still, nothing could be secured. After years of work, Nintendo eventually got tired of the lack of progress, as did their QA department, and decided to scrap the project entirely in 1996. Kid Kirby was no more. I think the game actually looked fairly nice in its way, but it was just a simple for the kids thing. Probably wasn't taken very seriously by the company, but I was too young and naive to understand that. Shortly after, Nintendo cut ties with DMA. Various complications with Body Harvest, the planned to be launch title for the N64, caused Nintendo to drop the project, leaving DMA to find a new publisher. With one project cancelled and another not up to snuff, Nintendo had no reason to pursue further projects with DMA. There is a happy ending to this story though. While some of the projects DMA was working on in the mid-90s went unreleased and others were flops, some did end up being surprise smash hits. Various members of the Kid Kirby team, like Pat Kerr and composer Colin Anderson, among others, jumped ship to work on another project, a little game called Grand Theft Auto. Mike Daly and Russell Kay have even named Pat Kerr a crucial figure in GTA's success, attributing the game's appeal to his exceptional vehicle physics, which gave it the fun it was severely lacking. The original Grand Theft Auto would release on the PC in November of 1997. Its success was a shock to many employees who viewed it as a troubled project akin to Kid Kirby. It was the start of a new era for the company. Take-Two Interactive acquired BMG, the publisher of GTA and Body Harvest, in March 1998. As a result, several Take-Two employees transitioned to a newly established subsidiary called Rockstar Games. While key personnel such as Jones, Daly, and Hammond departed, the DMA name endured. Under new management, they continued developing games, starting with GTA 3 in October 2001. Subsequently, in May 2002, the company underwent a name change to Rockstar North, a name that has remained unchanged to this day. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that Kid Kirby played a noteworthy part in Rockstar's history, as its cancellation opened the door for many of the original staff on Grand Theft Auto. DMA was going through a chaotic time in the 90s, and it was through this chaos that concepts like GTA could get off the ground. So next time you're playing GTA, running over civilians and gunning down officers, thank Kirby for making it possible. More specifically, thank Kid Kirby, the cutest pink puffball Dreamland never saw. As of the writing of this video, a playable copy has yet to be discovered. Of all of the people we reached out to for today's video, none managed to keep anything from their time at DMA, as they simply didn't have the means to save their work then. Mike Daly claims to have a demo stored in his archives, but he himself admits it has since vanished. The images from Daly's Flickr account, as well as the rough copies of Steve Hammond's manual, are currently all that survive. But who knows? Maybe one day a prototype will emerge from the archives of Rockstar North, or be found hidden away in a Nintendo employee's closet. Considering the high-profile stuff unearthed in the last few years, it's entirely plausible. Only time will tell.
Many lost video games have been documented in recent years. This kind of documentation is incredibly important for the preservation of video game history. But did all of these lost games actually exist? We've decided to delve into the history of 3 lost Nintendo games and see if they truly are a lost video game or perhaps just a rumor or misunderstanding that got out of hand. So without further ado, let's get into the games. Next up is F-Zero for Virtual Boy, a game that some fans call G-Zero, and others refer to as Zero Racers. According to a number of websites, including the Lost Media Wiki, Unseen64, and a couple of F-Zero wikis, Zero Racers was only shown to the public once, and that was at E3 1996. But we couldn't find any evidence that the game ever made an appearance. We watched old footage, read old magazines, and even spoke to some gaming journalists and one Nintendo staffer who were there, but absolutely no one saw it at E3 1996. So we reached out to Chris Radke, the guy who founded Planet Virtual Boy all the way back in 1999 and still runs it to this day. He told us, "In the early days of documenting the Virtual Boy, we believed that Zero Racers had been shown at E3 1996, and at one point that info was on Planet Virtual Boy, but nowadays we know that the game has never been shown at any trade show, and strangely it was never covered in any Japanese magazines. No video footage of Zero Racers exists to my knowledge." He told us there's a couple homebrew games hosted on his site, Formula V and Elevated Speed, which are about as close as we're ever gonna get to seeing Zero Racers in action. Truth is, Zero Racers was only ever seen in 2 issues of Nintendo Power magazine, the July 1996 issue with this tiny preview, and the August 1996 issue with this much larger preview taking up 2 full pages. With help from Art of Nintendo Power, we got clearer and higher resolution scans of these magazines than what was available anywhere on the internet, so you can actually read the tiny text for the first time. Those are the screenshots you'll be seeing throughout this video. We should note that a few other magazines from that time period also mention G-Zero, but their information and screenshots were just lifted from Nintendo Power, so all screenshots we're using here are directly from the original. The unfortunate truth is that no one's ever seen Zero Racers gameplay, at least no one outside Nintendo. So with a little help from Planet Virtual Boy, we got in touch with Jim Warnell, a localizer who worked at Nintendo of America for almost 2 decades. After exchanging a few emails, we had an hour-long Zoom call so Jim could share his story. He told us, "As an associate producer, I wrote screen text, manual and package text, oversaw the debug and approval process, liaised with NCL, worked with marketing and advertising, etc. Anything that had to do with the North American launch of a game was my responsibility. G-Zero, later known as Zero Racers, was on my list of projects. Zero Racers was done. We had a complete manual, package, and label done for the game. It went through lot check. It had an ESRB rating. It was complete." He also said the game's title was changed from G-Zero to Zero Racers late in development to avoid confusion with F-Zero. Zero Racers wasn't a subtitle, it was the game's full title, because it wasn't a direct sequel to the SNES original. It was actually a spin-off. Presumably the G in G-Zero and the Zero in Zero Racers are both references to gravity, since instead of cars, this game had spaceships, and all 15 tracks were made of tunnels where you can fly in all 4 directions. As far as how it sounded, Jim says, "From what I can recall, it was like F-Zero in a tube. It wasn't bleep and bloopy, it was very tin and metallic-y. There wasn't background music from what I can remember." Nintendo Power's preview shows 4 ships, the Falcon, Stingray, Goose, and the Origami, but it never revealed who was inside. According to Jim, the 4 racers were Captain Falcon, Jody Summer, James McLeod, and an alien that he can't say with 100% certainty, but he's pretty sure was Pico, who piloted the Wild Goose in the original game. Jody Summer wasn't in the previous game, but eventually made her way into F-Zero X on N64. The same can be said for James McLeod, a human character clearly modeled after the father of Fox McCloud. from Star Fox. Jim said he didn't have to localize much text for the game itself, as it was a pretty straightforward racer, but there was some story text in the game's manual, just like the SNES original. Jim also told us just how extreme the testing process was back in the 90s, saying, "When they were testing people out for Virtual Boy, they had us go through this. Did you ever see the movie Clockwork Orange? The scene where the person's pinned down in the chair and they've got their eyelids open? That was kind of like what Virtual Boy testing was like. They would dilate our pupils, they would have us sit with our heads in this vice type thing, and they would shine light in our pupils. They would have these plastic rods, they would have them just barely touching our eyes, and they would say, okay, no matter what, don't blink for a minute." They put us under just the most bizarre tests, just to make sure, I guess, to make sure the thing was safe to use. They would blow air into our eyes, they would have us play a Virtual Boy test kit for 10 to 15 minutes, then we'd have to rest. Then they dilate our eyes again. 2 or 3 rounds of these just bizarre, inhumane torture tests just to make sure this thing wouldn't kill me or blind me or whatever. But, yeah, it was interesting. It was a pretty harrowing experience, but fortunately things turned out pretty well for Jim, since he got to voice the announcer in the series' next game, F-Zero X.
You got boost power! Yeah! The final lap!
Zero Racers was completely finished, localized into English, had its packaging and manual, and was rated E for everyone by the ESRB, but Nintendo canceled it along with 2 other complete games at the very last minute, which Jim attributes to probably wanting to leave the Virtual Boy behind and focus gamers' attention on the upcoming Nintendo 64. Zero Racers wasn't found in the recent Nintendo Giga Leaks, but Jim's confident Nintendo still has it in a vault somewhere and could bring it back anytime. That's probably never gonna happen, but who knows? Maybe we'll see it on Nintendo Switch Online someday. So with first-hand testimony from Nintendo's localizer and an official rating from the ESRB, we rate Zero Racers as 100% real.
Okay, now on to Metroid 64. But before we get to the modern day quotes, let's dig through some old magazines to see what the devs said back in the 90s. Tons of classic Nintendo series made their transition to 3D on the Nintendo 64, but that didn't necessarily have to be the path forward for Metroid. Miyamoto still had a lot of enthusiasm for 2D games in the early 3D era, as well as excitement for what the Nintendo 64 could achieve in 2D that wasn't possible on the Super Nintendo. And he said as much over the course of several magazine interviews. He told GameFan magazine in August 2000, "Before, yes, the technology allowed us to only make 2D games, but now we have the option to make 3D games as well. It's not about a transition, but rather the expansion of the alternatives we now have. As a matter of fact, I don't think the possibility of 2D has died down at all. It will just keep on going." And he told Nintendo Power in October 1996, "The N64 is really an interesting and exciting machine. In some cases, 2D images created on the N64 may be more interesting than 3D graphics. We can create high quality and cool 2D graphics." As for N64 Magazine UK, he said, "3D graphics are fine, but polygons offer a kind of solid graphics. And if you like it, that's alright, but texture-mapped graphics are always limited to set ways, and they will always look similar. However, when it comes to 2D graphics, there's a variety of ways in which you can paint the original pictures that are used in the game. You could use an airbrush, you could use a pencil, you could use chalk, or many other ways. You can paint the pictures in any way you like." And in Gamers Republic November 1999 issue, he stated, "After working for years on developing games on N64, I don't think it's necessarily right that action games all be in 3D. Nintendo didn't end up making many 2D games for N64, but Yoshi's Story is the best example of one that did get made. It was also the best-selling example, with Miyamoto describing it as 2.5D with a cardboard art style. As far as graphics and gameplay, Metroid 64 could have been a direct sequel to Super Metroid. A great template could have been Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which released 6 months after the Nintendo 64 hit store shelves and spawned the genre-defining term Metroidvania, even if it was meant to have a mocking connotation at the time. There were a lot of requests for Metroid 64 in the 90s, and Miyamoto said he was passing along fan letters to the guys in charge. He was also bringing it up in high-level meetings. Gamers Republic magazine asked Miyamoto, "What remaining 16-bit sequels might we see on the Nintendo 64? Miyamoto laughed and said, "Well, Metroid. Although I'm not the Metroid producer, whenever I come across the opportunity in a company meeting, I try to suggest it." Miyamoto had a lot of sway, but unfortunately Metroid wasn't under his control. The series was under Nintendo R&D 1, who were too busy making Virtual Boy games like Mario's Tennis and Wario Land, as well as Game Boy games like Wario Land 2 and 3 and the Game & Watch Gallery games. In fact, that's pretty much the only games they were making for the 5 years after Super Metroid. And according to Miyamoto, that was keeping them too busy to make any N64 games. What he didn't mention was that the Metroid series' sales were declining with each new entry, which was presumably one of the reasons 8-bit Wario was taking priority over 64-bit Samus. Wario Land sequels weren't just quicker and easier to make, they sold better too. And despite its critical acclaim, Symphony of the Night's sales were pretty lackluster. People just weren't really buying 2D games at the dawn of the 3D era. So even if Miyamoto was still a believer in 2D, financially speaking, 3D might have been the only viable option for Metroid 64. And that brings us to something of a roadblock: Super Metroid's director Yoshio Sakamoto's problems with 3D. Looking back years later, he said, "I was actually thinking about the possibility of making a Metroid game for the N64, but I felt I shouldn't be the one making the game. When I held the N64 controller in my hands, I just couldn't imagine how it could be used to move Samus around. So for me, it was just too early to personally make a 3D Metroid." Using the joystick, just like any other 3D game, seems like the obvious answer, but Sakamoto has some interesting hang-ups when it comes to controllers. A decade later, he insists that Metroid Other M not use a Wii nunchuck, but instead only use the Wii remote held sideways, like an NES controller. In another interview, Sakamoto gave a few more reasons why he didn't make Metroid 64. That the story was already wrapped up at the end of Super Metroid. That it'd be difficult for his team at R&D 1, who made Game Boy games, to make an N64 title, and that the console's graphical limitations would have made it difficult to achieve the realism the series was known for. Those are all pretty good reasons why R&D 1 wasn't the right team for the job. But the most interesting part of both these interviews is when Sakamoto says Nintendo asked an outside studio to make Metroid 64 for them. Essentially, the same thing Nintendo did a few years later when they outsourced Metroid Prime to Retro Studios. Except in that case, Retro accepted the offer. But for Metroid 64, the offer was refused. Quoting Sakamoto directly, he said, "Nintendo at that time approached another company and asked them if they would make an N64 version of Metroid, and their response was that no, they could not. They turned it down, saying that unfortunately, they didn't have the confidence to create an N64 Metroid game that could compare favorably with Super Metroid. That's something I take as a compliment to what we achieved with Super Metroid." To us, that sounds like it might have been a polite way of declining Nintendo's offer, and maybe there was a bit more to the story. Which raises a couple of pretty big questions. Who did Nintendo ask to make Metroid 64, and what was the real reason they turned it down? Sakamoto purposely didn't say. He was asked to identify the studio, but he declined. Talking to folks in the industry, most rumors point to two Western studios: Rareware, the makers of Banjo-Kazooie and GoldenEye, and Rockstar, the makers of Lemmings and, of course, Grand Theft Auto. We set out to explore these rumors with mixed results, so let's get into it. One page of Nintendo history that's been mostly forgotten nowadays is the Ultra 64 Dream Team, about a dozen Western studios that Nintendo assembled to make exclusive third-party N64 games. Rareware was part of the Dream Team, and so was DMA Design, the studio who later became Rockstar. At the time, the company's founder, David Jones, said they were, quote, effectively a first-party studio belonging to Nintendo, and Miyamoto himself was directly involved with the Dream Team's management, to the extent that one executive highlighted their relationship by saying, quote, Mr. Miyamoto came to the first meeting in San Diego. We had the honor that this mother effer came to us. We spent a few months tracking down some lower-level guys from different corners of Rockstar, and most of them said they would have loved to work on Metroid, but no, they didn't hear about an offer from Nintendo. So we talked to a couple Rockstar producers. One of them said he had heard the rumors back then, but as far as he knew, they were just rumors. We even spent an hour on the phone with Jamie King, one of the 5 guys who founded Rockstar Games back in 1998. He was more than just a founder, though. He worked on countless titles, including the GTA series and some games for the Nintendo 64. Jamie was very friendly and forthcoming. He'd heard the rumors too, but again, just rumors. You can't go much higher than founders and producers. We can't rule out Rockstar with 100% certainty, but we're pretty confident they weren't the studio who turned down Metroid 64. So what about Rare? They were Nintendo's golden boy back in the 90s, and Miyamoto especially was a big fan. When he was asked what developers outside Nintendo he most admired, he didn't even have to think about it. Rare, he said. Rare makes very good games, but otherwise there are not many unusual or unique games out there at the moment, and that's what we should all be doing. Miyamoto expounded on that in other interviews, saying, quote, "Rare's games are similar to Nintendo's, but the quality is extremely high. Rare has been able to make Nintendo 64 games which are even better looking than our own. Rare has done a lot for the gaming industry. All of Rare's games are 3D, but they all have very different gameplay. They are encouraging us to create a different genre of games that departs from 3D adventure gaming. Miyamoto was even in one of Rare's games, Perfect Dark. So we started looking into Rare. Just like Rockstar, the lower level staff didn't know much about it. But one guy we spoke to was Martin Wakely, the head of Rare's design team back in the 90s. He told us, "I do have a vague recollection of talking about it in the old boardroom. I would have been making the decisions from the dev team perspective, and if it was offered to us, I probably would have said yes. I think the most likely thing that happened was Nintendo could have approached Rare about it, but it was at a time when Rare were keen to establish their own IP, and as a result get a higher cut of royalties, and it probably got rejected for that reason alone. I would have been the only person from the team involved in any discussions. Above me, it would have been Rare's management, Simon Farmer, or Rare's founders, the Stamper brothers, who would have spoken to Nintendo." So, money. That sounded like a more realistic reason an outside studio would have passed on Nintendo's offer. It took another year to get a hold of Simon Farmer. He's a very private person, and from what we've gathered, he's retired on a beach somewhere. We thought we were getting close to solving the mystery, but unfortunately he told us, "There's no Metroid dirt, so you're barking up the wrong tree. Have a mojito for me." We're friendly with former Rare producer Kevin Bayliss, and he backed up Simon's comments, saying, "Yeah, just a rumor. I used to spend a lot of time with Simon, so it sounded odd. If he'd have known, I'd have known." That means, if it was Rare, the only people who knew were the Stamper brothers, but they're infamous for almost never granting interviews, and unfortunately we couldn't get them. For good measure, we also talked to some guys from Retro Studios, including Metroid Prime's original director, John Whitmore. He said Retro wasn't offered Metroid 64 and didn't think Rare did any work on it either.
I think if Rare had done it, we would know about it.
We also got in touch with Perrin Kaplan, a former Nintendo of America executive. In a 1997 magazine, she said she'd heard Metroid 64 was in development, but when we talked to her, she couldn't remember what she'd heard all those years ago, and neither could her business partner. We also spoke to a few other studios, but it was all wild goose chases and dead ends. So unfortunately, after 2 years of digging, we couldn't get a definitive answer on who turned down Metroid 64.
Did you know? You could plug Game Boys into a Nintendo 64 DD and use them as controllers with screens. For those unaware, the 64 DD was a disk drive add-on for the Nintendo 64, with internet functionality for downloads and online play, an internal clock so games could track the time and date, and rewritable storage for saving massive amounts of data. All these features combined were meant to expand what a video game could be. The DD had dozens of games in development, but after 2 years of repeated delays, the add-on ended in failure and only sold 15,000 units, with all but 9 of its games ultimately cancelled. One of the games that would have supported Game Boy controllers was DT Blood Masters. The game was half funded by Nintendo and even had the so-called God of Games, Masanobu Endo, in the director's chair. Never heard of him? Endo created the arcade game Xevious, among others, and he was the longtime mentor of Pokemon creator Satoshi Tajiri, who later in life said Pokemon would have never existed without Endo's games inspiring him. Maybe this is the first time you're hearing of Endo, but needless to say, he is a legend, and with him in charge, DT Blood Masters was destined to be something special. DT was announced at Space World 99 as a collectible card game RPG. For simplicity's sake, if you've ever played Pokemon the card game on Game Boy, it would have been kind of like that, but with a very different tone. According to Endo, as far as the feel, it's a mix of playing cards in the neighborhood and world domination set in the near future. There's a secret organization controlling the world economy on one hand, but ordinary people appear too. It has a fully realized story with RPG progression elements. You have your own unit you're the commander of, and you design decks to battle with, so there's also simulation elements. DT Blood Masters also stood out in execution, playable on both the 64 DD and Game Boy. There are actually 2 games in development, one for each system, that you could link together to unlock more features and content. Or, as we touched on earlier, use your Game Boy as a controller with a screen. For example, you could use this in multiplayer so no one else could see the cards in your hand. Up to 4 friends could play together, provided they had 4 Game Boys. You could also download post-release cards and content off the internet, and trade cards with people online. Endo was so into what he was making that he was already talking about sequels on DD and Game Boy. But in late 2000, DT's official website announced that Blood Masters was cancelled and profusely apologized to disappointed fans. Their hand was forced because they had just found out the 64DD's online service RANnet was getting shut down. Nintendo publicly considered releasing Bloodmasters free to all RANDnet users, which implies it was pretty much finished, but in the end decided not to. Instead, he just released a modified version of Game Boy DT as a standalone product. It launched a half year later as DT Lord of Genomes. Pokemon's catchphrase is gotta catch 'em all, but DT's catchphrase was children should not buy this. It was pretty story heavy and similar to Magic the Gathering in terms of gameplay. It spawned a few sequels on mobile, but unfortunately the series always stayed exclusive to Japan. No footage or screenshots of the 64DD version were ever made public. Nintendo eventually canceled and never released the Game Boy to N64 transfer cable, but they later recycled the idea by letting fans plug Game Boy Advances into their GameCubes. When the Nintendo 64 came out, Miyamoto said it wasn't a complete machine on its own, that its true form is when it's combined with the 64DD and Game Boy. Unfortunately, we never got a taste of that full experience. According to the 64DD page on Wikipedia, a total of 61 games were announced for the disk drive, but cancelled in one form or another. Some were downgraded and released on a standard N64 cartridge, a few were upgraded to GameCube, others jumped ship to competing consoles, and a good chunk were cancelled entirely, sometimes when they were almost finished. We spent hundreds of hours researching primary sources in Japanese and found about 10 more games that Wikipedia left off. And also quite a few games on their list that are actually, well, fake. In an attempt to make the definitive 64 disk drive video, we're gonna cover all of them. Every single game, real or not. Most of them we scrounged up new info for, but since there are so many, we'll sum up each one in a couple of minutes, though the more important games will get closer to 5. Your Marios, your Zeldas, Pokemon. We'll get to all the big names soon enough. But first, let's do a less famous one that might have topped them all.
You must eat my flesh and clothe yourself with my fur. You must return to the human world and tell them what you know.
Jungle Emperor Leo was once touted as the biggest Nintendo game of all time. Shigeru Miyamoto's attempt to bring his childhood to life and share it with younger generations with hopes for a sequel already in mind. Information online is pretty scarce and some of it's wrong, so we went looking for more in old Japanese magazines. But before we dig into the games, first we need to touch on the history. Osamu Tezuka is probably the most famous mangaka in all Japan, where he's known as the father of manga. In the early 50s, he authored a series called Jungle Emperor, about lions living in Africa as mankind encroaches on their kingdom. In the 60s, when Miyamoto was a kid, Jungle Emperor was adapted into an anime, and continued to get more adaptations in the following decades, all with divergent stories. In the West, the franchise was renamed to Kimba the White Lion. You might remember seeing commercials when you were a kid. If not, you must have at least heard of The Lion King. Released in 1994, The Lion King drew protests in Japan saying the characters and plot plagiarized Jungle Emperor. Over 400 Japanese artists and animators signed a petition pressuring Disney to give proper credit to Tezuka. Disney denied all claims, but even the actor who voiced Simba initially thought he was in a movie about Kimba.
You must avenge my death, Kimba. I mean, Simba.
All that's to say, Jungle Emperor is a big deal, especially in Japan. Osamu Tezuka died in '89, at which point his son Makoto took over the family business. Makoto was making a new Jungle Emperor movie, and at the same time working with Miyamoto on a video game adaptation that'd be a fresh take on the original tale. Tezuka Productions was creating the game's characters, art direction, music, and sound effects, with Nintendo in charge of everything else, like gameplay and level design. For this project, Miyamoto told the press, I felt it was important that my colleague and artist Mr. Tezuka was the director, while I took a back seat. I embarked on this project to take his father's world that we were all raised on and share it with the younger generation. The game was first announced at Space World 97 with a release date of spring 98, and extremely early gameplay was shown off at the next Space World. In Japanese magazines, Tezuka said he was aiming to make a grand adventure that outshined Mario 64 and really tug at the player's heartstrings. Leo would use his intelligence and strength to fight off enemies and preserve peace in Africa. There'd be jungle settings, ocean areas, and more. Later, Miyamoto said the first few levels were already finished and undergoing polish, but they decided to push back the release date another half year. Total development, including tools and programming, was estimated to be half finished. There's some confusion online if the game was for the Nintendo 64 or the 64 disk drive. Some sites say they don't know, and Wikipedia says different systems on different pages. But according to Miyamoto, it was on a 16 megabyte cartridge, and if things went well, he wanted to make a sequel for the DD. But neither game ended up being made. Makoto Tezuka said he'd like to do some directing, Miyamoto told the press. I grew up reading his father's comics, and they had an incredible influence on my generation. Because of this, I decided to work with Makoto. But later, he decided to give priority to his Jungle Emperor Leo movie project. So we had to bring the game development to a halt. I'm very sad too. I feel sorry for Nintendo fans who are looking forward to this game. Makoto ended up releasing the film in theaters in 1997. A dual launch of the movie and the game together could have been explosive, and a disc drive sequel might have given way to a full-blown series. But sadly, now the best we can hope for is a ROM of those first few levels leaking online someday. Now a best-selling franchise, the original Animal Crossing would have never existed if it wasn't for the disc drive. It was born from the idea of the 64DD, co-creator Iguchi said in an interview. From there we came up with the concept of a game where you hang out and do stuff with a bunch of people in a single field. We all had little ideas of games we wanted to make, and Animal Crossing became all those ideas piled together. The other co-creator, Nogami, chimed in to agree. Basically, we all just wanted to make something for the 64 disk drive. They were going to make full use of the disk drive's capabilities, like the internal clock and mass amounts of rewritable storage. But when the DD died, they had to downgrade to cartridge. Some ideas got lost in the mix, like RPG-style dungeons, 4 islands based on the seasons, and online functionality. But the internal clock was so important to the core gameplay for holidays, seasons, and the day-night cycle that they decided to install battery-powered clocks in every cartridge. Players were also required to use controller packs to increase writable storage. Otherwise, the game couldn't remember all the changes you made to your town. Thanks to all the workarounds, they were still able to salvage a game out of it. They finally released their social simulator in 2001. It was the last N64 game Nintendo ever published. 8 months later, it was re-released on GameCube with some additional content and features that got left out of the cartridge version. Then that version got heavily reworked for the American market, with new items, content, and holidays that make sense to Westerners. The Western localization was so different and high quality, Nintendo translated it back and released it in Japan again. In other words, Animal Crossing ended up as one of the weirdest, latest N64 games with 3 unique versions in Japan alone, thanks in no small part to the death of the 64DD. Then again, the DD was the only reason Animal Crossing was dreamed up in the first place. It was inspired by the technology itself. At this point, you might be wondering, why was Nintendo transitioning to floppies when CD-ROMs stored 10 times more data? Nintendo was fighting a losing battle, but cartridges and floppies still had their advantages. Carts had basically no load times, and enough writable storage to save your in-game progress, but they were expensive to make, and at launch only held 8 megabytes. CDs, on the other hand, were cheap to produce and held over 600 megabytes. But they also had long load times, and no rewritable storage. That's why PS1 games needed memory cards. Some games were a better fit for cartridges, and others for CDs. Final Fantasy couldn't fit on a cart. But if you put something like Zelda on a CD, the load times would make it virtually unplayable as it searched for specific bits of data. .64DD floppy disks were sorta a middle ground. They were 64 megabytes, fairly cheap to produce, with only minimal load times. But there was one thing that made floppies special: mass amounts of rewritable storage. Up to 38 of its 64 megabytes could be used for saving data, equal to 300 PlayStation memory cards. With that, entirely new kinds of games could be made, games that could remember everything, offering experiences impossible on CD or cartridge, like Zelda 64, Mother 3, and Cabbage. You know what? Let's talk about Cabbage right now, actually. One of the most promising 64DD projects, which would have been revolutionary if it ever came out, was a game called Cabbage, a virtual pet simulator taking full advantage of the disk drive's capabilities. Created by an all-star team, led by Shigesato Itoi, creator and director of the Mother series, Tsunekazu Ishihara, founder and president of the Pokemon Company, Satoru Iwata, the genius programmer instrumental in bringing Pokemon to the West and later became president of all Nintendo, and Shigeru Miyamoto, who needs no introduction. Unfortunately, no images or footage were ever released from its years-long development, because they wanted to wait till launch was imminent to make a big splash with the character reveals. The core ideas and mechanics were explained in various magazines and web interviews, so that's what we'll be digging into in the next few minutes. According to Itoi, in a word, it's a breeding game. A game where you can play with your friends. We're flying this game under the radar of Yamauchi, the Nintendo president. That's what's fun about it. There'd be more than one creature, according to Iwata. You'd be breeding 10 different kinds of creatures. And they weren't literal cabbages, by the way. That was just a word Itoi blurted out and everyone seemed to like. Cabbage is just the name for a little creature, Miyamoto explained. You can buy it things, give it food, and raise it. The game uses the 64DD's internal clock, meaning the creature can evolve and change even if you're not playing. You can go out for a few hours and find your creature has totally changed when you get back. But it's inevitable players will have to leave their house. To stop Cabbage from being neglected, a Game Boy cartridge can be used as a basket. You can put Cabbage in his basket and take him with you, using the Game Boy to cater to his every wish. Of course, the Game Boy screen will look different than the 64DD version. When you get home, you can release him back into the virtual world on your TV. While the 64DD will be the major base for playing the game, we want people to download specific stages onto a Game Boy cartridge so they can take it with them on the train to work or school. We've been showing Pikachu because it's good illustrative B-roll, but they said the concept was more like Tamagotchi, the Japanese digital pets that took over the world around the same time as Pokemon, selling over 40 million units from 1996 to 98. But Cabbage actually started development 4 years before Tamagotchi, as a Game Boy game, and it was going to be a lot more ambitious than Tamagotchi. The Dream Team had big plans, like releasing more discs over time that provide your Cabbage with new equipment. Swings, slides, ponds, all kind of stuff that alter the game and how its Cabbages evolved. They were going to set up kiosks at stores, where you'd insert discs to download content and events. You could also download content through 64DD online as cheap microtransactions, and trade Cabbage toys back and forth with your friends. The 64DD's internal clock was so integral, the entire reason the DD even had a clock is because Iwata asked Nintendo to make it a hardware feature specifically for Cabbage. If not for that, there would have never been an Animal Crossing. Iwata was also cooking up systems that would let Cabbage simulate the thoughts and genes of human beings, so the creatures evolved in ways that the creators couldn't anticipate. Talking about how DD hardware works, he said, there can be slightly different content on each disc, even for the same game. The ID number's written onto the disc based on the exact second it's manufactured, and the software can change the algorithm and content of the game based on that ID number. In other words, there's a possibility of playing one-of-a-kind, self-reproducing software without knowing what'll happen next. We're going to use sophisticated programs that mimic the genetics of living things to create characters that develop in unpredictable ways, just like real creatures. The patterns are infinite. We can finally see it all coming together, Itoy proclaimed in 1997. Now that Iwata from HAL Labs has joined us, the tools we're using to make Cabbage are drastically modernizing. Making those tools is the most laborious part, so it looks like that part's finishing up. And it's all moving forward. But by 2000, Cabbage had kinda fizzled out. Miyamoto said the Japanese gaming market was shrinking and Itoy and Ishihara had gotten too busy. Ishihara with Pokemon and Itoy with Mother 3, which, as you'll hear about later, never got finished either, at least not the original version. Miyamoto thought maybe they could eventually pull themselves together and finish Cabbage for GameCube, but that never happened. Years later, he repurposed some of Cabbage's ideas to make Nintendogs, which went on to become the Nintendo DS's second best-selling game of all time. Now, if you're still having trouble imagining what Cabbage would have been like to play, Miyamoto said it would be a lot like Seaman. Out of the dozens of DD games in development, only 9 ended up releasing. 4 of them were Mario Artist games. Mario Artist Paint Studio was a launch title, and essentially served as a sequel to Mario Paint on Super Nintendo. It also came with some preloaded 3D environments you could explore, edit, and take pictures in, which seemed out of place in a Paint game, right? The reason it's there is because Paint Studio started development as a sort of god game called Creator, but Nintendo Japan and Nintendo of America fought over its direction, with Japan emerging victorious and turning it into Mario Paint. The Pokemon Snap exploration mode was left over as the bones of Creator's rotting carcass. But anyway, a couple months after Paint Studio, Mario Artist Talent Studio came out, which was all about making your own characters and playing around with them. A few months later, Mario Artist Communication Kit, which served as a bank to deposit stuff you made in the other entries and share your creations online. And finally, the last game ever released for 64DD, Mario Artist Polygon Studio was a 3D graphics editor that let you make your own polygonal objects. All 4 games worked together, but there was also a 5th entry that never came out, Mario Artist Soundmaker, which is exactly what it sounds like on the tin. It's a sound maker. We did a dedicated video on the Artist series a few years ago, so if you're interested, it's got more details on that series. And although they weren't Mario themed, there were a few more Maker games that got cancelled before so much as a screenshot could be made public. DD Sequencer for composing music, Video Jockey Maker for editing video, Game Maker for making your own games, and Graphical Message Maker, which, to be honest, that one probably didn't need to exist anyway. Regardless, DD floppies were the perfect medium for these kind of games, thanks to their 38 megabytes of rewritable storage. Official PS1 memory cards only held 1/8 of a megabyte, meaning DD games could save 300 times more data than PlayStation games. You can save a whole lot of creations on one disc. These kind of games were part of Nintendo's strategy for rethinking what video games could be. Most other games are like little boxed gardens, which Miyamoto likened to Disneylands, full of rides and amusements the developers cooked up to entertain you. But Miyamoto said these Maker games were like dropping you in a field with nothing but a stick to play with, and you have to make your own fun. Wait, that sounds kinda boring as hell, doesn't it? No wonder no one bought the DD. He really did say that, but I think what he was trying to say is these games drop you in a field and give you the tools to make your own rides, your own Disneyland. But even still, that sort of thinking only appeals to a niche audience. That said, Mario Artist is the prime example for another more interesting strategy for rethinking the games industry, what Nintendo called the product group concept. Games that could be played on their own, but enhanced when combined with more games. You can play Paint Studio by itself, but you can do more if you have the other Mario artists too. SimCity was at the core of the second product group. Simcopter's attached, of course, but Miyamoto also wanted to expand it with a crazy taxi style of game where you drive around some cities, racing customers to their destinations as fast as possible. Or another where you listen to radio traffic reports so you can plan out the ideal street route to outrun cops chasing you. DD floppies were cheap to produce and easily overwritten, so smaller games and expansions were much more feasible than what was possible on cartridges. Miyamoto said these sorts of budget titles might sell for as little as $5. Different product groups could overlap as well, like letting you turn your drawings into SimCity citizens. That feature did ship actually, but most other ideas fizzled out when the DD failed to find an audience. While Mario and Zelda were transitioning to 3D, Yoshi remained as one of the few holdouts clinging to 2 dimensions. His '97 sequel was originally called Yoshi's Island 64 as a continuation of the best-selling SNES title, but eventually got rebranded as Yoshi's Story. It's on Wikipedia's list of announced 64DD games, with their only source being IGN's response to a reader's email, where IGN claims unnamed Nintendo of America representatives told them in private it'd be on disc. But Nintendo Japan always said Yoshi was a cartridge game, before IGN's mailbag, and after. They even said it was for N64 at Space World 96, literally the same event that Nintendo of America told IGN it was a disc game. Every Japanese magazine preview listed it as an N64 title as well, going back to the very beginning. We're not saying IGN's lying, maybe Nintendo of America did say that, but if so, it appears they were misinformed. Nintendo's other premier 2.5D title, Kirby 64, is a similar story. It's on Wikipedia's list too, but without any citation. We went through tons of Japanese magazines, and again, Kirby was always said to be for the N64. Same goes for the internet. At the very start of development, Miyamoto said it was coming to N64. IGN asked him, "Do you mean 64DD?" And Miyamoto said no, they're making it as a cartridge game, though it is transferable in either format. But that could be said for pretty much any N64 game. They could all be transferred to disc. So it doesn't seem like Kirby was ever meant for DD either. Now, it's possible that there were discussions at Nintendo like, hey, maybe the 64DD will launch in '97 and sell 1 billion units, and by the time Yoshi and Kirby are done, it'll make sense to put them on disc. But we can't find proof either game was ever announced for DD, seriously considered, or made to use the disc drive's capabilities. We can only find evidence to the contrary. So we don't think Yoshi and Kirby really belong on a list of canceled disc games. Okay, at this point we need to digress. We've been giving Wikipedia a hard time, but we don't want you to get the wrong idea. They're generally a great source of information, and making this video without their DD games list as a springboard would have been even more laborious. Wikipedia gets it right most of the time, but this particular list hasn't been maintained in ages. The only reason we keep bringing it up is because your average gamer who's curious about 64DD games will probably Google and end up on this Wikipedia page and take it at face value. Or the 64DD wikis list, which is mostly the same as Wikipedia's but with no sourcing. So we feel it's appropriate to point out where wikis got it wrong, and add new information where we were able to find it. And hey, we make mistakes too. By the time you're seeing this, there's probably already comments rightfully pointing out errors in this video, or some context that we should have included. Wikipedia covers every subject known to man, so their job's infinitely more difficult to accomplish without ever being wrong. And their contributors do it for free. We spent hundreds of hours on this video and had it proofread by 64DD experts like Luigi Blood and series superfans like Cody Nicolo. But we don't have every Japanese magazine, and we don't know everything. After this video has been seen by thousands of people, it's inevitable some will know more than us about certain subjects. Some of y'all might have even worked on some of these canceled games. So please feel free to point out errors in the comments, or if your information's of a more sensitive nature, you can always contact us privately through Twitter. In summary, Wikipedia is a great, accessible resource, but it's not a primary source. There's always more information than what's on Wiki, and no one can be right 100% of the time. That applies to Wikipedia, IGN, and us too. Okay, on to the next game. A 64DD version of Super Mario 64 was exhibited at Space World 96 and shown off in lots of magazines, but never came out. Fans and gaming press alike were left speculating about what exactly the game was. An expansion for the original? Maybe an enhanced remaster? Almost 2 decades of theories were finally put to rest in 2014, when a French N64 collector named Jimmy130 found out a long-lost copy was sitting in a second-hand shop in Japan. God only knows how it got there. The shop seemingly had no idea the kind of treasure they had, so when they listed it on Yahoo Auctions, Jimmy bought it. It's primarily the same as the cartridge release, though it's got a few slight differences. You might have noticed the first one already, the music. Here's a couple comparisons. Cart versus disc. Due to the disc format, there's occasional brief load times. And also some random photos in the internal data, presumably used for testing, like selfies of Atsushi Watanabe, who worked at Nintendo's Integrated Research and Development Division. But there's no extra levels or enhanced graphics, nothing like that. And the music's actually the same as the original, just recompiled with a different sound engine. It's not like Nintendo went through the trouble of recomposing it. So, disappointingly, it looks like it was just a tech demo all along, never meant to become an actual product, and thus, not technically a cancelled game. Folks thought it was for decades though, and some old rumors are still up on the internet, so we thought we'd include it on our list. And heck, it's just an interesting piece of 64DD history. You'll be happy to hear the ROM's been dumped, so nowadays anyone can download Super Mario 64 DD and play it for themselves. That's Super Mario 128, not Super Mario 64 2. They were two different projects, though they sometimes get conflated. 128 was a GameCube tech demo shown off at Space World 2000 that eventually kinda turned into Mario Galaxy and Pikmin. Mario 64 2 was for 64DD, so that's the one we're gonna dig into. It was the last game Miyamoto ever directed, or at least it would have been, if he ever finished it. As soon as he completed the first game, he said, "I couldn't put everything into Super Mario 64 that I really wanted, so we've decided to continue working toward a sequel, which will take about a year and a half at least." Later adding, the first game is only using about 60% of the N64's hardware power, you see. There's really so much more we could do, so we decided to save those ideas for next time. Luigi was famously cut from Mario 64, and bringing him back was a core component of the sequel. But not for multiplayer, it'd be more like Resident Evil 0 or Pikmin 2, where you control both or switch between Mario and Luigi for puzzle solving and other utilities left up to our imaginations. Yoshi also got cut from the original, except for a post-game cameo, and Japanese magazines reported he'd be returning in a more prominent role, though Miyamoto never confirmed that detail. "I'm changing the gameplay system, adding more enemies and retooling the display and graphics," he teased months later. "Last time I only designed for a cartridge, but next time I will take advantage of the potential of the 64DD. I plan to utilize the 64DD's read and write functions to create a new type of game." After a couple of years, he said the game was half finished and he had a prototype with Mario and Luigi running around on his desk. But he didn't have time to focus on it because he was too busy with Zelda 64. Miyamoto promised that once Zelda was done, he'd refocus on his favorite plumber. But he was overseeing about 10 games at once as producer and supervisor, and having a hard time being everywhere at once. Yoshi's story got delayed, so he moved developers over there to finish it up quicker, but that caused Zelda to get delayed, and then in turn, got Mario delayed. Meanwhile, he was also producing Star Fox, Mario Kart, Mario Artist, Pokemon Snap, F-Zero, Mario RPG 2, Smash Bros, and more. Nintendo had laid too much on his lap, more than one man could handle. But still, development continued, with him later saying his team was also experimenting with 4-player split screen, and insiders telling press the other two characters were Peach and Toad. It's a long, complicated mess of a story. We just gave you the cliff notes, but if you want the longer version, we did a dedicated video on Mario 128 and 64 2 a few years ago. To wrap up this summary though, Miyamoto's Tower of Cards eventually collapsed, resulting in 64 2 quietly getting cancelled, along with a lot of other games you're hearing about in this video. Miyamoto stayed on as series producer, but gave the director's chair to Yoshiaki Koizumi, who went on to make the Mario 128 tech demo, Sunshine, Galaxy, and is still directing 3D Mario to this day. No footage or screenshots were ever made public of 64 2. And for fans hoping the prototype will leak online someday, it remains probably the holiest of 64DD holy grails. We debunked Yoshi's Story being a 64DD game earlier, but while we were reading up on Mario 64 2, we stumbled over an interesting tease from Miyamoto. Talking 1 year after Yoshi's Story was already out, he says they're now experimenting with a DD Yoshi game, which the interviewers interpret to mean Yoshi's Story 2 is in the works, although it also could have been a disc expansion for the original. But the way things turned out, Yoshi didn't get another game until 2004 on the Game Boy Advance. I don't know if it's accurate to call these Yoshi 64DD experiments a cancelled game exactly, but still, it's interesting to learn the disk drive could have not only had Mario 2, but Yoshi 2 as well. If it did come out, it might have been the only 2D platformer in the add-on's entire library. Metal Slater Glory 2 isn't on any disk drive game lists, but it should be. This one's not appealing in the sense you'd necessarily want to play it, but because it's bizarre and of extreme historical significance. You'll see what we mean, but before we get to the DD, you'll need some background on the first game. In 1987, HAL Laboratory artist Yoshimiru Hoshi was putting together a presentation at his desk when Satoru Iwata walked by, and was like, "Wow, I've never seen graphics that good. Look at those characters. You don't even need to make a presentation, I hereby approve your game. In fact, I'm going to help you make it." Iwata served as both programmer and producer until the game was finally completed 4 years later. It's famous for being one of the most expensive Famicom games of its time, Iwata recalled with a laugh. It's actually kind of amazing we stuck to it, persevered, and eventually released it, but from a management perspective, it was a mistake. At 8 megabytes, the cartridge was insanely huge for a Famicom game. That's the same size as Mario 64 a couple console generations later. Unfortunately, HAL went bankrupt trying to promote it. Nintendo said they'd bail them out, but only if Iwata was promoted to become HAL's new president. HAL accepted. A decade later, Iwata became president of Nintendo itself. All Nintendo history in the years since would have been a lot different, and probably worse, if it wasn't for Metal Slater glory. As for the game itself, it's a text-based adventure set in 2062, not long after a great war between space colonies. The protagonists sort of accidentally come into possession of a Metal Slater Gundam, which houses a secret message warning the Earth is in danger. They investigate and find out the space colony war was a cover-up, and the real war was between colonists and aliens. Not only that, but the aliens are capable of disguising themselves as humans, and have infiltrated our government. We won't spoil the rest. A fan translation came out in 2018 if you want to experience it yourself. Yoshimiru wanted to make a sequel for 64DD and actually wrote a book about it in 2013 called The Truth Behind the Phantom Game Project. It took a while to get a copy and have it translated, but it was worth the trouble. Honestly, we wish every scrapped project got a book like this. It says in 1997, Yoshimiru pitched a prequel starring Yayoi Kisaragi, who played a bit part as a waitress and secret soldier in the first game. This prequel takes place 1 year earlier and also features her 4 sisters, all between the ages 12 and 19, each with lengthy bios detailing their unique personalities. It's a girls' game, Yoshimiru writes. The title would have been The 5 Kisaragi Sisters, spread out over 5 discs, with each sub-story being about 3 hours long and centered around a different sister. They'd release a few months apart and use the 64DD to its fullest potential. Rewritable storage, voice acting, and using all that disk space for several novels worth of dialogue. Every disc could be played on its own, but your save data carried over if you played them all, with incentives to replay again and again. But the further you get into Yoshimuro's book, the more you realize it's not exactly for girls. It's actually what the Japanese call a gals game. If you're not familiar, that means it's a game starring attractive young girls with teenage boys as its target audience. For example, Mitsuke, the 17-year-old. She does have a distinct backstory and personality, but the first sentence of her bio says she's a big-breasted girl with a 96F bra size. Double exclamation marks. Now, the first game did have a flirty male lead, and occasionally panty shots and stuff like that, but it was all in service to a sci-fi narrative. I'd like to think the 64DD prequel would have had a riveting story of its own, but the book doesn't get into any of that, at all. It's only interested in telling us about the girls, and saying again and again, making it very clear that this is a gals game. We found Yoshimuro on Twitter and asked, so what is the story? He said it's set in a Yokohama school where you build relationships with the 5 sisters. We inquired further, asking if it ultimately lead to science fiction like the first game. His answer? There was nothing sci-fi about it. Then he made an uwu face. I almost can't believe that this was the pitch to follow up the most advanced game ever released for Famicom. So anyways, about that pitch, Yoshimuro took everything you'd just seen and showed it to Nintendo, who said, actually the 64DD is getting delayed and things are kinda uncertain right now. So we're sorry to say, maybe this isn't the best time to begin development. In his book, Yoshimuro admits, in hindsight, the gals angle might have been a problem too. HAL told him that since the prequel wasn't going to happen, they'd let him port the first game to Super Famicom instead. Yoshimuro took that ball and ran with it, and with a small team, made more than a port. It was a full remake with better graphics and some R-rated dialogue cut from the original. Metal Slater Glory, Director's Cut, came out in late 2000. It was the last game ever released for the Super Famicom. Yoshimuro has made other stuff in his career, but he considers Metal Slater Glory his life's work. In the decades since, he's made more Slater manga, books, a drama CD, toys, and never stopped dreaming about one more playable experience. Currently, he's hoping to make it a virtual reality game. After rare success with the Donkey Kong Country trilogy, they started making a new game for Super Nintendo codenamed Project Dream, also known as Dream Land of Giants. Led by Rare co-founder Tim Stamper, Dream was an action RPG starring a boy named Edson and his dog Dinger, who cross swords with pirates on the hunt for a magic potion that'll make their ships fly. Edson and his girlfriend have to flee the pirates' wrath, and that's how the story gets going, with fantastical elements like giants and dinosaurs thrown in for good measure. I started at Rare in October 1995, composer Grant Kirkhope recalled. I was shown Dream running on the SNES and was blown away. It looked beautiful and was obviously going to be a big step up from Donkey Kong Country. The console generation was coming to a close, so development moved to the 64DD. According to a couple devs we talked to, the DD was chosen over the standard N64 for its extra storage, rather than any DD-specific features. At this point, Dream dropped the fantasy feel in favor of a golden age of piracy theme, to avoid seeming childish. Over 100 tracks of music were made, some of which you're hearing now. After a while, Stamper felt the boy hero wasn't working in this more mature world and wanted him swapped out with an animal. So they replaced him with a rabbit, then a bear who up until that point had been a minor side character. Later, the Dream team saw an early build of Mario 64 and thought, this looks more fun than what we're doing, let's change Dream into a Mario-style platformer instead. If you haven't pieced it together yet, the bear protagonist was named Banjo, and 16 months later it was released as a little game called Banjo-Kazooie. It's interesting to note, the game actually spent longer in development as Dream than it did as Banjo. Tim Stamper occasionally teases pieces from his collection, and last year he posted this on Twitter.
Arr, so it's true then. The Nintendo 64 treasure does exist after all. Ha 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 ha! It's mine, all mine!
That's Captain Black-Eye, leader of the pirate antagonists. He later shows up in Banjo-Tooie, where he complains that a bear stole his glory, as a backhanded nod to Project Dream. Zoom in on Stamper's video and you can see the dev cart says latest version of Dream 64, dated November 96. Supposedly, it's the only copy that still exists. Fans begged him to release it to the public, but he's unlikely to ever do so. He just likes flaunting his treasures. Wall Street was announced in '99 and designed around the DD's internet connection and displayed stock prices updating in real time. Though to be clear, it wasn't software for investing, just a simulation for entertainment. Now some of y'all are probably thinking, hurry up and get to the games we actually care about, like Mario and Zelda. That's pretty much exactly what Japanese press said in '99, to which Nintendo president Yamauchi's response was, quote, Wall Street is the 64DD's Mario and Zelda. He called it the disk drive's killer app. Virtually zero info was ever published in English. No one even knows who was making it. We managed to find out in some old Japanese magazines. Turns out it was Recruit Co., who was Nintendo's partner and co-owners in Marigal and RanNet. In one interview we found, RanNet's president said, when we give away the free demo, people are going to be surprised. Some people will probably get addicted to it. It's a completely new financial simulation game that's very different from menu-based games of the past. It's not just buying stocks and making money, it's in 3D. When I saw it, I was amazed at the graphics. It's going to be unlike anything you've ever seen before. He went on to say that after the Super Mario Club examined Wall Street, it was their most anticipated DD game. In another interview, RanNet said it was aimed at adults, while gameplay details were always kept secret. Were we going to be pumping, dumping, and bankrupting entire countries? Maybe exploring New York's financial district and completing missions? Unfortunately, it seems we'll never find out, since the disk drive flopped soon after, at which point Wall Street and a ton of other projects got canned. Fans never got to see so much as a single screenshot. We've mentioned a few expansions so far, and we've got more coming up, so now's probably a good time to explain how they worked. Most 64DD games were standalone. You just stick the disc in and you're off to the races, but some were expansions like F-Zero. You put the F-Zero X cartridge in the N64 and then insert the disc to add more features to the base game. In F-Zero's case, that meant a dozen more tracks, a car creator, track editor, and the ability to save 100 custom tracks to disk, and combine them into custom cups. Oh, and new music. Check it out. This one's a remix of Mario Kart Rainbow Road. Quite a few expansions were announced, but F-Zero is the only one that ever released. And as of the making of this video, only one more is leaked online, which we'll get to later. One last thing about expansions, they require hooks in the cartridge they're expanding. Hooks are basically lines of code that say this cartridge will get an expansion. What's weird though is that Superman 64 and Automobili Lamborghini don't have any hooks, meaning it would have been impossible to give them expansions. Possibly sometime after announcing Superman and Lambo's expansion, but before the carts came out, Titus decided to quietly cancel their expansions, then deleted the hooks to save cartridge space. Probably not though, since hooks only take up a few dozen kilobytes, which is basically nothing. It's more likely that Titus didn't know how expansions worked and were too incompetent to know they needed hooks in the first place. Pokemon Stadium is a game that doesn't need to exist. Stadium's intro cutscene even calls itself POS version 1.0, and they ain't lying. We jest, but remember how upset fans got when Sword and Shield only had 400 Pokemon? Well, imagine a game with only 40 Pokemon. Stadium was originally announced as a launch title for the 64DD. In fact, previews show it fully playable in early '98. With a DD disc 64 megabytes, you could fit tons of data. And originally, it was promoted as a sort of Pokemon bank. Trade your Game Boy monsters over and save them to disk. There's more than enough space to store them all. But the DD kept getting delayed, 5 times actually, and they were worried the Pokemon fad wasn't going to last forever. so Stadium got downgraded to regular ol' N64 onto a cartridge with just 40 Pokemon and only capable of banking 120. Stadium was content poor, and beyond the novelty of seeing a few dozen 3D Pokemon models, it didn't serve much purpose, which is why it never left Japan.
What? Unbelievable!
Some of y'all are probably thinking, I'm sure I played Stadium as a kid, what are you talking about, it never left Japan? Well, the game you played was actually Pokemon Stadium 2, but outside Japan, it was just called Pokemon Stadium. You played the second game. It's what the original disc game should have been, with 151 Pokemon, storage for 240 mons, minigames, and more. Stadium 2 was initially supposed to be a disc 2, actually. It was planned as an expansion, not a sequel. But by 1999, there was less and less reason for the N64DD to even exist. When Nintendo first dreamed it up, the 64MB disc format had a lot of promise, because early in the console generation, they didn't know how to squeeze much storage onto a cartridge. Super Mario 64, for example, was only 8 megabytes. A couple years later, Pokemon Stadium was on a 16MB cartridge. By the time Stadium 2 rolled around, they'd figured out how to fit 32 megabytes, and eventually all the way up to 64 megabytes. So as the add-on kept getting delayed further into the future, it became less and less relevant. Fun fact, to fit all 251 Pokemon, the next Stadium was one of only 3 games ever released on a 64MB cartridge. It's Pokemon Stadium Gold and Silver in Japan, but overseas they called it Pokemon Stadium 2, even though Pokemon Stadium 1 is really Stadium 2. A little confusing, but it's worth noting that Stadium 2's code supports a DD expansion of its own, which suggests Stadium Gold and Silver might have been intended as that expansion, which would mean all 3 stadiums were originally meant for 64DD before switching to cartridge. Fire Emblem Maiden of Darkness, also known as Fire Emblem 64, would have been the series' 6th entry. According to Miyamoto, progress was steady and on track for a late '98 launch. Only one screenshot was ever made public, years later in the Japan-only Fire Emblem 25th Anniversary book. The game would have been 3/4 view, as you might expect, visually a middle ground between the SNES and GameCube Fire Emblems. The Japanese book also includes some art for unused characters, like Taki, Lynette, Helen, Idun, and a few characters without names. The protagonist would have been Roy, who actually got into Smash Bros. Melee despite his debut in Fire Emblem 64 being cancelled. Roy got repurposed for future Fire Emblem games, but Fire Emblem 64's absence left him in the awkward position of fighting in Smash Bros. Before he appeared in his own franchise. Fire Emblem series creator Shozu Kaga said Fire Emblem 64 was too ambitious, then resigned from the company in autumn 2000, with the game publicly scrapped soon after. The next Fire Emblem actually released on SNES, an unusual step backwards considering the N64 was over 3 years old by then. Some elements of Fire Emblem 64 made it into later games, like the Binding Blade, but for the most part, all work on the DD game got thrown out. No ROM or even footage of Fire Emblem 64 has ever leaked online, but that Japanese book did include a page of in-game dialogue. We'll flash it up on screen if you want to read it. Consumers don't need to buy personal computers, they can get a 64DD instead. That was Nintendo's thinking when they teamed up with computer memory manufacturer Hagiwara Syscom, electronic makers DAT Japan and Tokyo Electron, and Fujifilm Co. to make Mario no Photopea. It's basically Photoshop wearing Mario as a skin suit, but even worse than it sounds, as Nintendo themselves didn't do much of the development. It released on cartridge in '98, and what a cartridge it was, just look at it. The slots on top are for smart media cards, so you could import photos from a '90s era digital camera. It was only released in Japan, so we've been showing you a fan translation, otherwise you'd have no idea what you're looking at. Nintendo announced a disc expansion would follow 6 months later to make use of the writable storage, basically just to let you save more pictures. Fast forward 6 months and the 64DD still wasn't out yet, and Mario no Photopea's expansion was never heard from again. Despite immense popularity in the 80s and 90s, the Far East of Eden RPG series has mostly stayed region-locked in Japan. Only one entry was ever localized in English, and that was a fighting game spin-off on Neo Geo. Not long after, Hudson Soft announced a return to the turn-based format with Far East of Eden Oriental Blue for 64DD. But thanks to the add-ons delays and eventually piss-poor sales, Oriental Blue found itself quietly cancelled. In 2003, a game with the same name released on Game Boy Advance in Japan. In short, it's set in a world where Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, and Thailand-inspired cultures coexist, and the hero, he or she, your choice, has to restore peace after a spirit-stealing orb corrupts a nearby castle town. It mostly scored 8 out of 10s, and got enough love for admirers to craft an English fan translation. But according to its director, the GBA game was nothing like the earlier Disk Drive project, after they had gone back to the drawing board and had to, quote, start over from scratch. The original was canned, as far as we can tell, before a single screenshot or any details were ever released aside from the title itself. And thus, Far East of Eden, Oriental Blue remains one of the disk drive's most enigmatic RPGs, which probably would have turned out pretty good. We keep saying games got cancelled or downgraded to cart because of the DD's repeated delays. But why was it delayed? The original N64 launched in June '96 with 3 games, Mario, Shogi, and Pilot Wings. The disk drive wasn't delayed because Nintendo couldn't figure out the hardware. As a matter of fact, it was finished in May '97 and announced to release at the end of the year. According to Miyamoto, there'd be 5 launch titles: Pokemon Stadium, Mother 3, SimCity 64, Mario Artist, and 1 game they were keeping secret. That's a pretty good lineup. Unfortunately, Mother 3, which was promoted as the must-haviest of the 5, fell into development hell. Mario Artist wasn't ready either, and wouldn't be for over a year. And we're not sure what secret game Miyamoto was teasing, but it doesn't appear it was ever finished. So all they really had for launch was SimCity and a half-assed Pokemon Stadium, and thus nothing system-defining like Mario had been to the core console. So Nintendo pushed back the disk drive's release a few months to March 1998, but the situation didn't improve, so they pushed it back again, to June '98, then late '98, then June '99, and finally a 5th and final delay to December 1999. At this point, third-party studios had lost enthusiasm for the add-on, and PlayStation 2 was only 3 months away. Nintendo knew they were screwed. Maybe if Mother 3 had been done on time, or Super Mario 64 2, or Ura Zelda, if anything of substance was ready in '97 or '98, the disk drive could have taken off. But they just couldn't put together a good launch lineup till it was too late, and that's why the 64DD was dead on arrival. Taking advantage of the DD's internet functionality, Randit discussed 3, guess you could call them, live service games. The first was tentatively titled My Horse Racing Magazine, which they said would partially go live the same month the DD launched. Quote, "You'll become a fictional horse owner and participate in imaginary tournaments while getting the latest horse racing news and information, in an entirely new type of online game." It sounds kind of like fantasy football, where you design a fantasy team, then what happens in a real-life NFL season dictates your team's performance. So winning largely comes down to strategizing and staying on top of the news. Randnet also said they were planning a digital baseball magazine and digital Formula One magazine, which would essentially be the same concept, but for baseball and racing. Users would have had to pay subscriptions for all 3 games. Before we get to more games, let's quickly examine the 64DD online strategy. There were some netplay games, but Nintendo was more focused on functionality that didn't require high-speed internet. Part of their plan was basically an eShop selling smaller DD games, plus a small library of NES, SNES, and Game Boy titles. For bigger DD games, you could watch gameplay videos and pay through your DD, and then they'd send you a physical copy via mail. Every game would also have basically its own subreddit within RandNet, so you could suggest future expansions to the devs or just chit-chat with your fellow fans. Another example was the F-Zero page would have a time trial contest. Gamers could also produce their own content, like selling guides and tips and tricks collections for $1 or $2. This is a change from the old system of feudalism where game companies unilaterally sold software to gamers, explained RandNet president Kayama. It's a kind of democracy. If you want to make money making games in the future, the 64DD is a must-buy. He also alluded to users making in-game content, but the DD died before any of that came to be.
Put your hands together if you wanna clap as we take you through this monkey rap.
As soon as Rare finished up the Donkey Kong Country trilogy on SNES, they immediately got to work on a 64 follow-up. It spent the first year and a half not as a 3D game, but as a side-on adventure. If you've read up on the game's history, you might have heard it referred to as 2.5D. That's really a misnomer though, it was side-on, not a side-scroller. For example, Donkey Kong Country Returns and Tropical Freeze were 2.5D side-scrollers, and direct continuations of the SNES trilogy. But Donkey Kong 64 was not a country game, it actually played more like early builds of Banjo-Kazooie, which looked like this. We talked to Rare artist Carl Tilley, who compared its smaller, more linear stages to Crash Bandicoot. The design was more like side-on Crash, with levels that you play once, he said. I can't remember if we even had many or any collectibles in it at that point either, but eventually we realized the design was lacking and it had no replay value. After Mario 64, free-roaming 3D platformers were seen as the way of the future. So Rare broke up the DK team and brought in some Banjo-Kazooie guys who turned Donkey Kong into another free roamer. The side-on prototype never got shown to the public, but we've been told some NDAs are expiring soon and screenshots will make their way online probably later this year. Ultra Donkey Kong is on Wikipedia's big list of announced but cancelled disc games, and strangely, it also says the 64DD itself was canned. None of that appears to be true though. For starters, Ultra Donkey Kong was just one of several names made up by the press, derived from the fact that the N64 was originally called the Ultra 64. As for being on DD, sites like GameSpot reported that in '97, saying they heard it from Japanese press. Japanese magazines did have it tagged as a DD game, but in the actual text they would say things like, will the N64 version be a traditional side-scrolling action game, or an RPG taking advantage of the 64DD's features? They didn't really know anything, because DK64 wasn't even officially mentioned till a year later, and wasn't properly revealed till 6 months after that. It wasn't announced for DD and never developed for it either. Tilly was on the team before and after the breakup, and he told us the game didn't have any specific designs to make use of the 64DD in pre-production, and Rare management wouldn't have wanted to release on the DD. Hardware sales dictated where best to sell the game. In other words, even if DD sales did meet Nintendo's expectations, it only would have sold 1/10 as much as the base console. So even in the best scenario, it never would have made financial sense for Rare to release Donkey Kong 64 on disc. We talked to a couple other devs, who don't recall it ever being meant for DD either. Since we're contradicting common belief, we wanted to be extra certain of this debunking, so we ran this all past DK Vine, a superfan site covering the series since 1999. They were adamant that it was all just rumors and said none of their contact or sources have any memory of it ever being for 64DD. So it is disappointing to find out Nintendo mascots like Donkey Kong, Kirby 64, and Yoshi's Story were never actually disc games despite their inclusion on every DD games list on the internet. It certainly makes the disk drive lose some of its luster, but there's still lots of games that were real, and made clever use of the hardware's unique features, like... Mother 1 and 2 were never huge sellers, but they attracted cult followings with their quirkiness and unique sense of humor. Mother 3, also known as Earthbound 64, was one of the disk system's most promising projects. Unfortunately, it also had one of the most troubled developments. In 1992, series creator Shigeru Itoi said he was making Mother 3 with a Super Nintendo CD-ROM add-on. When that add-on got cancelled, development moved over to a standard SNES cart, then later moved over to N64, then to the 64DD, then back to the N64, until ultimately landing on Game Boy Advance in 2006, some 14 years after the project began. It's hard to even say what the game was, since it took so many different forms, so for the sake of brevity, we'll mostly focus on the 64 and DD versions. The team was made up of Itoi's Ape Inc., Iwata's HAL Labs, and even some Pokemon devs. Their plans were ambitious and would have made full use of the disk drive's unique features. Mother 3 was divided into 12 chapters, each with a different protagonist, some adults, some kids, and some non-human. Probably the most recognizable was Lucas, thanks to his role in the Smash Bros. Series. All 12 protagonists live in different places and different times with different motivations. The one thing they do share is all their worlds have a Chimera Forest, which supernaturally connects all of their disparate strands together. Here's the story from the Space World 99 official guidebook. Quote, "The main characters are a family of 4 with a dog living in a peaceful village. One day, after an unidentified object appears in a nearby cove, strange events start occurring in the village. Then, from the depths of the forest, an unsettling, terrifying scream can be heard. What's happening in those woods? To protect the forest, the village, and his beloved family, the Father Flint ventures into the trees. Here's a strange world that you can't quite decipher between the Middle Ages or the Old West," Itoi explained. And in the end you realize the circumstances of what made it so strange. It was made in a way that you'd be thinking, this is weird. Then you make it through chapter 11, and hit chapter 12 and scream. Iwata said the 64DD's read-write function was a core theme of Mother 3, letting every player make their own unique impacts on the game world, similar to Zelda 64. He explained that in other games, if you rearrange a room, then leave and come back, it'd be restored to its default state. Any changes you made were gone. But on 64DD, everything would be remembered, making it feel more real, like it was your own. That concept wouldn't just apply to your room, but the entire game. NPCs would remember past conversations so they wouldn't repeat themselves, for example. And thanks to the DD's internal clock, you could do stuff like sow seeds, and 3 real-life days later, they'd sprout. All the DD features were working in unison to make something special. But eventually the disk drive's future started looking bleak, so development switched back to cartridge, which meant losing all those DD features and slimming down the story to only 9 chapters. At one point the N64 version was roughly half done with a release date in May 2000, but after missing the deadline, Itoi announced Mother 3 was officially cancelled. The big game once announced as a DD launch title now wasn't coming out at all. But the story doesn't end there. A few years later, development picked back up on the GBA, with the game finally releasing in 2006 to reviews in the high 8s. Much of the story remained intact, but it got cut down even shorter. Originally it was 12 chapters taking place over a 10-year timeline, but just 8 chapters on GBA, spread over 3 years. The game famously never left Japan, but it didn't take long for fans to put together a high-quality translation of their own. Citing IGN, Wikipedia says after the game got downgraded to N64, there was an expansion disc in the works to add more content called Mother 3.5. Superfan Okeji Dragon asked a Mother designer if that was true in 2011, but he threw cold water on it, saying an expansion might have been an idea at some point, maybe, but they didn't put any actual work into it. And sadly, they never made a Mother 4. Series fans and DD enthusiasts have long dreamed of Mother 3 leaking online, but so far, no such luck. It's unknown how many copies even exist. Fans are aware of one copy in the hands of developer Brownie Brown, but lament there are no other leads to follow. We talked to some former Nintendo of America employees like localizer Jim Warnell, who said some copies came through there too.
We saw quite a few games that would come in for like early demo evaluation. I know we saw early versions of Mother 3. What I saw was just a really rough demo. I think it was the 3 to 4 main characters. From what I saw, it was really rough.
So instead of Japan, the superfans sniffing around for protocards might have more luck talking to devs on this side of the pond. If a build ever does leak, it might come from old NOA staffers. But after all these years, odds seem slim. Earthbound 64 might be the holy grail that forever remains buried, never to be found. Paper Mario was announced as a DD exclusive in early '97. Originally, it was conceived as a sequel to Super Mario RPG, which had been developed by Square. The sequel was initially called Super Mario RPG 2, and naturally Nintendo asked Square to make this one as well. But Square turned them down because they already had their hands full making Final Fantasy VII. So they hired HAL Labs, the guys who made Earthbound. Then eventually the project landed in the laps of Intelligent Systems, at the time best known for the Fire Emblem franchise. Understandably, them picking up where Square left off was pretty controversial, and a lot of fans didn't think they were up to the task. They'd never made a 3D game before, unless you want to count Fire Emblem 64, which as we said got cancelled because they couldn't hack it. Intelligent Systems buckled down though and separated themselves from Square's offering with a brand new 2.5D aesthetic. By the end, it was no longer a sequel to Mario RPG, not in name, story, or even tone. The name changed to Paper Mario and finally released in late 2000 near the end of the N64's lifecycle, as a cartridge. Everyone loved it, but it only sold about half as many copies as the previous game, making it hard not to wonder how Super Mario RPG 2 might have turned out on disc, especially if Square had stayed in charge. We're going to talk about Pokemon RPG here in a minute, but for full context, first you need some backstory on Pokemon Snap. It all started in early 1995, a year before the first Pokemon Game Boy games released in Japan. Miyamoto, Iwata, and Itoy were talking about how rough devs had it at other companies, getting overworked just to crank out crap games. So they went to Nintendo president Yamauchi and said, why don't we hire some of these guys and give them complete freedom to make whatever they want for 64DD, with no deadlines. Surely they'll cook up something incredible. Yamauchi was an open-minded guy, so he said, yeah, let's do it. They named the new studio Jack and Beans and put out an ad calling all developers. It said, talent is like a seed. Water properly, it'll sprout and grow as high as the heavens. But some seeds are neglected, buried, and can't grow. What a waste. Come with us, little seeds. We'll give you soil and water. Nintendo's new 64-bit machine awaits. Then it revealed Jack and Beans was led by legends like Miyamoto, Iwata, and Itoy. 550 devs showed up, and Nintendo picked the best 11. They were all elated to have gotten picked. But when they arrived for their first day of work, they were surprised to find their new office was tiny with hardly anything in it. Until recently, it had been Nintendo's ping pong room. Iwata handed them an envelope stuffed with cash. Here's $4,000, he said. Miyamoto told them, make something that's never been done before. And they left. The big guys were thinking, oh man, I wish we had it this good when we were young. No managers breathing down our necks, no deadlines, total freedom. But in reality, those 11 devs were terrified. They didn't know how to make something never done before. They spent the $4,000 on a TV, refrigerator, and some cabinets. There was minimal leadership from the big guys. They were too busy with other projects like Cabbage, Mother, and Mario. No one was put in charge, so the Jack guys wandered aimlessly for months till they eventually started making a game about taking pictures. That was an original idea, they thought. And DD discs have lots of writable storage, which could be used for saving tons of pictures. Wikipedia and other sites say at this point the game was literally based on Jack and the Beanstalk, but actually that was just the inspirational recruitment ad. Truth is, it doesn't seem like the game had much of a plot, or even a name. Even the guys making it thought it sucked. There wasn't any motivation for the player to take pictures or any rewards for doing so. They scrapped it and restarted several times, and even after all that, the team said it didn't even feel like a game. After a couple of years, Pokemon was exploding in popularity, and the anime had just debuted. So Nintendo mixed things up by making Pokemon the thing players take pictures of. Some of the Jack guys didn't like that idea, but it ultimately gave them some direction. Originally, the player wandered around on foot, but after experimenting with an on-rail system in certain areas, Miyamoto told them to make the entire game on rails. They also added Professor Oak, who grades your pictures and gives you points, thus providing a sense of progression. The third game changer was letting players print out their pictures and share them with friends, which got fans connecting in real life, similar to the Pokemon Game Boy games. The team finally felt like they had a game on their hands. Late in development, it switched from disc to cart because they wanted to release it to line up with the first Pokemon movie. And also so they could launch before Gold and Silver came out, otherwise it'd make Snap look bad for not including any Gen 2 Pokemon. One of the main selling points in previews was being able to save all of your photos. In fact, disk's writable storage was why they made the camera game in the first place. But after switching to cart, there was only enough storage to save 60 photos, not even enough for one picture of each Pokemon, which sort of undermined the game's original premise. Not to mention it only had 6 levels. Start to finish, the whole process lasted over 4 years and really soured Nintendo's belief in giving devs total freedom and no deadlines. Fortunately, things turned out okay. Pokemon Snap finally released in spring '99 to decent reviews and a few million sales. Not a lot by Pokemon standards, but enough to keep the lights on in the ping pong room. That was a pretty long history on Pokemon Snap, but it was necessary context to better understand another game on Wikipedia's canceled disc games list, Pokemon RPG. In '98, IGN reported a game codenamed Pokemon DD was in development, and speculated it played like the Game Boy games. That speculation got spread as fact by folks like Lost Media Wiki, who said it was going to be the series' first console RPG. As we've already discussed, websites like IGN got a lot of their information from Japanese magazines. Digging through them now, we found those magazines were talking about a Pokemon RPG for DD back then. They don't have many details, though there was plenty of speculation, like maybe it'd come out as multiple colors like the Game Boy games. Or there'll be additional discs that add more forests and towns, which sounds awesome, but we couldn't find any statements from Nintendo backing any of that up. We did find an interesting interview from Miyamoto though in summer '97. When asked about Pokemon coming to the disk drive, he says, "For now, we plan to release 2 kinds of Pokemon game. One will be an entirely different genre from an RPG. That one will release first." The interviewer asks when. He says it'll be a DD launch title, but can't give away any details until the next Space World. With what we know now in the future, Miyamoto was clearly referring to Pokemon Stadium. Next, the interviewer asks, "And what's the state of the other one, the Pokemon RPG?" Miyamoto, "Well, right now, we currently have 10 staff members working on the Pokemon RPG, but we plan to add another 20 people soon." End quote. This interview took place about 2 months after Jack and Bean's camera game was transformed into Pokemon Snap. At that time, you could run around freely, and what the game was exactly was constantly in flux. So it's understandable that when the interviewer called it an RPG, Miyamoto didn't say boo, especially since he didn't want to spill the beans until Space World. More revealing is when he said the RPG has 10 staff members. We know the Jack team was 11 guys, and 1 quit in the middle due to the troubled development. That makes 10. Miyamoto also says they're going to add 20 more. Pokemon Snap's credits, if you subtract the producers, localizers, and voice actors, and just account for the core team, shows a staff of 34. The math all adds up. The RPG was Pokemon Snap. After Snap officially revealed, Pokemon RPG was replaced with Pokemon Snap on Japanese magazine's upcoming game lists, with its genre switched from RPG to ETC. Meanwhile, in the English-speaking world, IGN kept on reporting that Stadium, Snap, and Pokemon RPG were all different projects. But Miyamoto said there were 2 DD games in development, not 3. Nintendo said that all along, even before the Miyamoto interview. 2 3D Pokemon games for 64 DD, which were revealed as Stadium and Snap in early '98. But before their official titles were revealed, both were referred to as Pokemon 64 and Pokemon DD interchangeably, which confused 90s journalists. There was also a 3rd game, Hey You Pikachu for N64, confusing things even worse. For about a year, Nintendo was constantly teasing these games to build up hype and sell consoles, while trying not to reveal too much before their official reveals. Even for us, with the benefits of hindsight and modern internet, sorting through all this mess was still confusing as hell. But after translating hundreds of pages of Pokemon primary sources over the past few years, it's clear that Pokemon RPG was born from vague statements about multiple titles and combined into one imaginary game fans wanted to exist. Did you know gaming's not innocent in all this either? We spread the Pokemon RPG rumor too in a video 5 years ago.
In a 1998 IGN article, the site listed 4 upcoming Pokemon N64 games: Pokemon RPG, Hey You Pikachu, Pokemon Snap, and Pokemon Stadium, implying Pokemon RPG was an entirely different game than Stadium, despite both being turn-based. It's thought the game would have been in line with the main Pokemon series, but for home consoles. The only first-hand mention of it was in a 1997 interview with Miyamoto, conducted by Electronic Gaming Monthly. When asked about the game's progress, he said 10 people were currently working on the game, and that while it was planned to come out in Japan, a US release was still up in the air.
Miyamoto was actually talking about Stadium 1 in that interview, which was indeed slated as a DD launch title at the time, and only came out in Japan. That's our bad. We should have dug deeper into primary sources back then instead of repeating surface-level internet info. Our sincerest apologies. We could spend another 10 minutes dissecting interviews and connecting dots, but I think we've made our point. To wrap all this up, Wikipedia says there are 5 cancelled DD Pokemon games. The Stadium expansion disc and Stadium 2 are the same thing though, so we'll cross one off the list. And we're going to cross Pokemon RPG off too. There were only 3 DD Pokemon games, plus 1 more if you count Stadium Gold and Silver, all of which released on cartridge. Okay, with all of that debunked, let's move on to some games that did exist. Mario Party came out in '98, followed up a year later with Mario Party 2, adding new boards and minigames. The internal code reveals the second game was actually intended as a disc expansion for the first, which is reflected on screen if you boot up Mario Party 1 with a random disc in the DD. The intro cutscene gets interrupted with an error saying to insert the correct disc, which doesn't happen with other N64 games, except the ones programmed to get expansions, like F-Zero and Ocarina of Time. In an alternate timeline where the DD released sooner like it was supposed to, and Party 2 was released on disc like it was supposed to, Mario Party 3 presumably would have been an expansion as well. From a technical perspective, it was indeed possible for one game to get multiple disc expansions. Both sequels came out on cartridge anyway, so it's not like we're missing out on content. We are missing out on money though, since carts typically sold for $60 and discs were $20 or $30. Now, I'm not butthurt about a few dollars all these years later, but it is an interesting footnote in DD history. And after that precedent was set, it'd be interesting to see how Nintendo handled the dozen sequels that came after.
The original Banjo-Kazooie was released in 1998 on Nintendo 64, the eventual result of an arduous string of ill-fated projects at Rare. The game was nonetheless a critical darling and a hit among N64 owners. As such, ideas for Banjo to grow into a major franchise were soon stirring. A sequel made in the mold of the original, Banjo-Tooie, was put into development around the launch of the first game in June '98. Just 1 year later, another Banjo game was already brewing in the background at Rare. With Banjo fans well catered to on the N64, the company turned its attention towards Nintendo's portable system, the Game Boy Color. During the summer of 1999, a small group at Rare began drawing plans to take the Bird and Bear duo in a new direction with their first adventure for handhelds. The project first existed under the title Banjo-Kazooie GBC and was poised to reinvent the series for this less powerful platform. Their original concept, as detailed in this project plan shared by a former Rare developer, was for a 2D platformer game. Through various twists, the project would ultimately evolve into a top-down platforming adventure for Game Boy Advance. It was released in 2003, named Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge. In an effort to understand more about the original vision for the game, I tracked down the architects of the now 20-year-old design documents. The first section of this literature was written on the 10th of August 1999 by Rare designer Desmond Hinkson. It focused not on how the game would play, but the narrative it would follow and how it would continue on from the events of the first Banjo-Kazooie. In fact, it was planned to be a more direct sequel than Banjo-Tooie was, taking place between the two games. At this early stage, the plot was noticeably different from how it would eventually end up in Grunty's Revenge on the Game Boy Advance. That game was set 2 months after Grunty's first defeat at the hands of Banjo and Kazooie. Unable to shift the rock she was imprisoned beneath at the climax of the first game, Grunty's minion Klungo creates a mechanical body for his mistress and transfers her soul into it. Grunty then seeks revenge on the two titular characters by first kidnapping Kazooie from Banjo's house. She then travels back in time, intent on preventing the Bird and Bear from ever meeting in order to undo her defeat and restore her original body. Mumbo uses his magic to send Banjo back in time to pursue her. As a side effect of the time travel spell, Banjo forgets his platforming moves from the first game and must relearn them from an old mole named Bozai throughout the game. The original synopsis, on the other hand, did not feature time travel and included different characters and settings. It opened a few years after Banjo-Kazooie as opposed to just 2 months. Banjo, Kazooie and Mumbo are holidaying on a farm. Bottles is also there, a character who doesn't appear in the final game at all. Furthermore, the documents do offer some context as to why Tutti, Banjo's sister, is no longer around, stating that she's away having an adventure of her own somewhere else. This idea was later dispensed with. The character was not mentioned in future games, save for a cameo in Banjo-Tooie where she can be spotted in a missing poster on the side of a milk carton. This version of the plot too would have featured Klungo creating a mechanized vessel for Grunty's spirit, although her evil schemes were somewhat different. She travels to the farm where the other characters are relaxing and unleashes a series of spells upon them. Bottles is transformed into a creature with 4 eyes, and Mumbo is cursed with excessively bad luck. She then warps Kazooie into an evil blue version of herself before kidnapping her. Mumbo runs after her, but his bad luck intervenes, and a comedic set piece follows in which a black cat scratches at his face, he runs under a ladder, and a mirror smashes on top of him. The blow leaves him with amnesia, unable to remember his spells. To make matters worse, Banjo has forgotten his moves in the peaceful years since the first game and must now relearn them. With his usual source for tutorials, Bottles, indisposed in his new form, Banjo seeks the counsel of Grandpa Mole, the father of Bottles. He may be blind as a bat, but the old curmudgeon taught him everything he knew, the document reads. As development went on, Grandpa Mole was changed to Boz-Eye, another mole from the past whose relation to Bottles was never specified. One key detail separating Grandpa Mole from Boz-Eye was that he would have relayed his lessons to Banjo by playing a crappy song, as the docs described it, on a gramophone. If the player collected enough musical notes, he would have also been able to use his music to open bonus levels wherein Banjo could collect honeycomb pieces to extend his life bar. In Grunty's Revenge, no such bonus levels exist, and the honeycomb collectibles are instead scattered around the various worlds. According to former Rare designer Gavin Hood, who was a part of the project from its inception, a major part of the game's early premise involved Gruntilda using Kazooie to enhance her maneuverability. With the evil bluebird stored in a backpack, she would have used Kazooie similar to how Banjo did in the previous game, pulling off various tag team platforming moves. At some point not too far into the game, Banjo would fight the witch and ultimately reclaim Kazooie, restoring her to normal. The majority of the adventure would have played out with their moveset expanded from then on. By October of 1999, this early form of the project came to be known as Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Curse. The person responsible for giving it that subtitle was Desmond Hinkson, who disclosed to me its supposed dual meaning. It apparently referred to both the curse Grunty was personally afflicted with, being bound in her spirit form, as well as the curse she had unleashed upon Banjo's friends. Evidently, a decent amount of time was spent developing these tentative plot and design details. Banjo's movesets, levels, enemy types and more are described in meticulous detail. Art was made for the documents, including sprites and menu concepts, demonstrating how it would fit within the constraints of the Game Boy Color screen. These included early renders of Banjo, Kazooie and Gruntilda in their reimagined 2D forms. With all of this laid out, the question remains, why wasn't this game made, and why did the final release deviate so much from this original plan? A large part of it, former developers say, was down to resource restrictions and timing. While the design documents were being drafted, there was no team available at Rare to make the game. According to Gavin Hood, he and other staff members were already busy on projects like Mickey's Speedway USA for Nintendo 64. This would remain the case into the year 2000. There was an expectation that Grunty's Curse would enter development as other projects crossed the finish line and more staff were freed up. However, another project took precedence. In 2000, Nintendo commissioned Rare to bring their SNES platformer Donkey Kong Country to its next handheld, the Game Boy Advance. Desmond Hinkson, who had written the plan for Banjo on Game Boy Color, was moved onto that project instead. With its lead designer otherwise engaged, Grunty's Curse was put into a state of limbo for some time to come. Once the port of Donkey Kong Country was sufficiently far along, Hinkson and other staff were finally at liberty to move forward with Banjo. The Game Boy Advance by this point had not long since released, and Rare was keen to capitalize upon it. According to Hinkson, it was Rare's management that decided to put his portable Banjo into production with a few provisos. It would now be made for Game Boy Advance as opposed to Color, and would undergo a shift in perspective. It would no longer be a 2D game, game and would utilize a pseudo 3D isometric style to make it more in line with the other Banjo titles. It would continue to morph as their plans were adapted for this new hardware. There were many elements lost in this transition, including whole areas that had originally been set to appear. The largest cut was a world named Mohendra Banjo, described as a temple set deep in the jungles of the east. Rare imagined it as being populated with ancient traps like moving walls and spikes, as well as hazardous creatures, spiders and scorpions. No such enemies appeared in the final game. They'd also envisioned using giant snakes as ladders and having tribal wall art of Banjo references decorating the ruins. In the finished game, there exists a world named Freezing Furnace, an ice level, which contains a sub-area with a steelworks theme. In it, Banjo has to avoid some high temperature hazards such as pools of bubbling lava. Originally, this area was intended to be its own separate world, dubbed Fiery Furnace. Lastly, there was supposed to be a more substantial section leading up to the final boss. Grunty's lair was once supposed to be its own distinct world, a horror-themed environment that combined elements from previous worlds, like the spiders of Mohendra Banjo and the lava pits from Fiery Furnace. It would have served as Banjo's last trial before his showdown with Mecha Gruntilda. In Grunty's Revenge, no such area exists. Once the player has collected enough jiggies, they can enter Grunty's castle and begin fighting her after a short cutscene. On the other hand, a number of different enemies were dropped too. Documents from October 99 considered bringing back more baddies from the original Banjo game, like the Big Butts from Mumbo's Mountain and the Muty Snippets from Clanker's Cavern. Some original enemies met the same fate, including magpies that would steal Banjo's items and rolling gluttonous gruntlings that would challenge Banjo to a race stroke pie eating contest. Overall, a considerable portion of content was scaled back as Rare iterated upon Hinkson's original plan. He explained why these parts in particular were curtailed. With the change to GBA came a condition, the pseudo 3D isometric view. This was really problematic. The GBA is not 3D hardware, so to handle the new environment I had to control my plans. It was a simple trade-off between the environments and the character interactions and story I wanted to explore. I had no choice but to prioritize the pseudo 3D world. Everything became more complicated, and we really pushed the GBA to its limits. In terms of concepts that didn't make it to the final game, every element in the game had to be weighed in terms of scope versus play value. I decided to go with the elements that our small team could do best and that players would enjoy most. Another element sacrificed in the project shakeup were certain transformations Banjo could undergo. A bumblebee form that would allow him to shoot stingers and traverse large gaps was scrapped, as was the idea for a gag transformation, the specifics of which had yet to be decided. A toaster with eyes or a milking machine had been entertained as possibilities. The nature of the project's evolution, which Hinkson discussed, helps us to understand why the story changed over time as well. But he ascribes another reason as for why the game's title was altered from Grunty's Curse to Revenge. The name change was a simple marketing decision, he said. It was felt that American parents would be less inclined to buy a game with Curse in the title. As for the game it once could have been on Game Boy Color, Hinkson says that he imagined it as a 2D action platformer, somewhere between Donkey Kong Country and Kid Icarus. Banjo-Kazooie Grunty's Revenge released to positive buzz from critics in 2003. Its past would remain an obscure open secret from Rare history for years to come, although that didn't stop the developers from referencing their original plans in the final game. When a relieved Banjo rescues Kazooie in the Breagle Beach level, he exclaims, "Kazooie, am I glad to see you? I thought Grunty would have made you into a monster by now," a nod to the blue monster form of Kazooie that was ultimately scrapped.
Did you know? Virtual Boy wasn't Nintendo's biggest failure. Despite its reputation, it actually sold more than the Satellaview and 64DD combined. Unfortunately, the old boy had his plug pulled after a few short months. So Nintendo could focus all their might on N64 defeating PlayStation, thus dooming Virtual Boy to the waste bin of history. In 1987, Nintendo released the Famicom 3D system, and Sega put out the Sega Scope 3D for Master System. Then in 1991, Sega announced they'd begun development on the next generation, Sega VR for Genesis. It's important to note, though, they weren't standalone systems, and certainly not portable. It was in that context that Shigeru Miyamoto started pestering Gunpei Yokoi to throw his hat in the ring. Nintendo President Yamauchi wanted Yokoi to explore it too. Eventually, he ordered him to do it. A tough situation was made worse, though, when Nintendo started pressuring him to release it sooner than he wanted. In 1993, Sega showed off Sega VR, which looked almost ready for market, and a wave of 32-bit competitors would soon follow, from 3DO to Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. Super Nintendo's 16-bit graphics looked ancient in comparison, and Nintendo 64 wasn't going to be ready till 1996. Nintendo wanted to release a new system as soon as possible to keep their investors happy and maintain relevance. Yokoi didn't think it was ready yet, but the call wasn't his to make. In April 94, President Yamauchi made the big announcement and said it would be playable at Space World later that year, and hit store shelves a few months later. Space World 94. Yamauchi climbed on stage and praised its innovation and affordability. At $200, the Virtual Boy was going to sell for less than half the price of other 32-bit systems. 3 games were rushed out as demos: Galactic Pinball, Telero Boxer, and Mario Bros. VB. Every gaming journalist from Tokyo to Timbuktu was there, eager to shove their face into Nintendo's new system. Yokoi was starting to feel 50-50 about its chances, but Nintendo itself was exuding nothing but confidence. Nintendo pledged 1 new first-party game each and every month. Third parties were enthusiastic as well. More and more kept throwing their hats into the ring, from Squaresoft to Rare, till eventually about 100 were making Virtual Boy games. Even Game Freak was thinking about doing one. Hype was reinforced by its launch in April 95, but unfortunately, early on, Yamauchi was worried someone would steal their technology, so he didn't give out dev kits till after it was revealed to the public. As a result, there weren't many games in its first few months. After launch, third parties saw the system wasn't selling, so a lot of them either cancelled their ongoing projects or just didn't bother starting new ones. That left the release calendar pretty barren, which was another reason the system ultimately failed. For a while, the plan was to regroup and have another go of it in America, considering how much better it was selling than in Japan. At E3 in May, Nintendo of America renewed their pledge to support the system and showed off a couple games to kick off VB's second wave. The first was Bound High, a top-down action puzzle game that made excellent use of 3D. As Chalvo the robot, you defend Earth from aliens by bouncing around stages on top of enemies to kill them and trying not to fall to your death. Bound High had 4 modes, including a story campaign with bosses every 10 levels. Yamauchi called it the most promising title coming to the system. There was also Dragon Hopper, developed by Intelligent Systems, the studio that did Fire Emblem, Paper Mario, and helped make Super Metroid. It was a top-down action-adventure akin to Zelda Link's Awakening, where you play as Prince Dorin, trying to make his way to the Kingdom of Celestia to save his family from its corrupt Prime Minister. It had everything you'd expect in an adventure game: NPCs, monsters, currency, shops, and so on, but with added 3D. G-Zero was revealed soon after, an F-Zero spin-off where instead of driving on flat roads, you're flying through space, with Captain Falcon and other familiar faces like James McCloud. All 3 games were gonna release soon, and more were in the works as well, like VB Mario Kart, Donkey Kong Country, Bomberman, and a GoldenEye racing game. But then, all of a sudden, it all disappeared. G-Zero, Bound High, and Dragon Hopper were 100% finished. They've been rated by the ESRB, and according to our sources at NOA, even their boxes and manuals were done. But then Nintendo stuck them in a vault, cut bait, and ran. Every third-party game was cancelled too. A small but passionate fanbase has formed in the decades since. In 2010, they finally got their hands on Bound High, which it turns out really was the system's best game. Nowadays, you can get it in a boxed cartridge or just play on emulator. Something similar happened with an FPS called Faceball a few years later. Fans have also made their own VB games like Star Fox and Mario Kart Virtual Cup, and some cheeky ports as well, like Snatcher and Street Fighter 2. At a 2013 shareholder meeting, an investor asked if VB games were going to come to Virtual Console on 3DS. President Iwata said he'd think about it, and that, quote, "It was not a commercial success, but some say that it was an attractive and extremely unique product by these standards at that time." Nintendo never ended up doing that either, but fans picked up the slack with their own 3DS emulator pretty recently, actually. Virtual Boy's gotten a reputation over the years as Nintendo's biggest failure of all time. That narrative's a bit overblown. VB outsold most of its 5th generation competitors, and that's with Virtual Boy only really being on the market for 5 months. For a while, it was on track to outsell some bigger systems too. Nintendo's Howard Lincoln recalls, "In 1995, Virtual Boy sold more product than Saturn did, which says something. I was sorry that certain key executives at Sega left before I was able to deliver the 50-pound bag of dog food to them. They having described Virtual Boy as the dog of the year. We outsold them and we got out." Which kind of makes you wonder, what if they hadn't got out? That second wave of games would have released and more people would buy the system, leading to a third wave and so on. Just imagine if 3DS got discontinued 5 months after its rocky launch. It'd be remembered as a failure too, with only a few games worth playing. But Nintendo doubled down, turned things around, and made lemons into lemonade. Virtual Boy never got that chance.